I worked double shifts in the freezing Chicago rail yards just to give my boy a fighting chance after his mother passed away. I never asked for a dime when he made his millions. I only ever wanted to see him smile. But as I stood outside his hospital room, my daughter-in-law looked at my worn-out work boots, commanded her private security to block the door, and told me I had no place there. She walked away, thinking she had just inherited $43 million and erased me from my son's legacy forever. She thought she held all the cards, but she had no idea about the letter my son's lawyer was holding. A letter that was about to turn her arrogant smirk into a mask of pure panic. My name is Tyrone. I am 65 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a railroad dispatcher on the south side of Chicago. I spent my life breathing in diesel fumes, pulling double shifts, and freezing in the winter winds, all to make sure my son David had a roof over his head and books in his backpack. When his mother passed away from breast cancer, David was only 10 years old. From that day on, it was just the two of us against the world. I took a second job loading freight just to pay for his college tuition. And when he came to me at 25 with a brilliant idea for a medical software company, but no investors who would look twice at a young black kid from the South Side, I walked down to the bank and mortgaged the only home I owned. I gave him every penny I had to my name. David took that money and built an empire. By the time he was 38, his company was worth $43 million. But to me, he was never a CEO. He was just my boy. It was a Tuesday night. I was finishing up a grueling 14-hour shift at the dispatch tower. My joints were aching, and I was looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and my bed. Then my cell phone rang. It was 2 a.m. A call at that hour never brings good news. The caller ID showed an Atlanta area code. David had moved his corporate headquarters down to Georgia 5 years ago when he married Chloe. I answered the phone, my heart already hammering against my ribs. A sterile professional voice on the other end identified herself as a nurse at Atlanta General Hospital. She asked if I was Tyrone, the father of David. I gripped the edge of the dispatch console and said yes. She told me David had been brought into the emergency room after collapsing at his home. She used words like severe cardiac event and stress-induced heart attack. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. I dropped my clipboard. I did not even clock out. I grabbed my jacket and ran to my old truck. I drove straight to O'Hare International Airport. I did not have a ticket. I did not have luggage. I just had the work clothes on my back, my steel toe boots, and a chest full of blind panic. I begged the ticket counter agent to get me on the first flight to Atlanta. By the grace of God, there was one seat left on a red-eye departing in 30 minutes. Sitting on that plane in the dark, staring out the small plastic window, I prayed harder than I had ever prayed in my life. I bargained with the Almighty. I offered to trade my life for his. David was only 38. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was healthy, strong, and brilliant. A heart attack made no sense. He ran marathons. He ate right. But then I thought about the stress, the brutal, unforgiving pressure of running a multi-million-dollar tech firm. And I thought about Chloe. Chloe came from old money. Her family had estates in Connecticut and trust funds older than the state lines. When David brought her home to Chicago to meet me, she walked into my modest house like she was stepping into a toxic waste dump. She looked at my worn furniture, my calloused hands, and my cheap coffee mugs with a polite frozen smile that disguised pure disgust. She never liked me. She never respected where David came from. To her, I was an embarrassing relic of a past David needed to erase. After they got married, the phone calls from my son became less frequent. The visits stopped entirely. I knew she was isolating him, pulling him into her world of high society galas and country clubs where a retired railroad worker did not fit in. But I swallowed my pride. I stayed away because I wanted my son to have peace in his own home. I sacrificed my own happiness so he could keep his. The plane touched down in Atlanta just as the sun was starting to rise. The sky was the color of bruised iron. I jumped into a taxi and told the driver to step on it. We tore down the highway toward Atlanta General. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pay the fare when we pulled up to the main entrance. I ran through the sliding glass doors, my heavy work boots thudding against the polished linoleum floors. I rushed to the front desk, my voice cracking, as I demanded to know where my son was. The receptionist typed his name into her computer. Her face softened with a look of profound pity that made my stomach turn completely over. She told me to go to the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. I sprinted to the elevator. Every second felt like an hour. When the doors finally opened on the 4th floor, I saw the sign for the ICU. I jogged down the sterile white hallway, my heart racing, desperate to see my boy, to hold his hand to tell him his daddy was here. But as I reached the heavy double doors of his room, my path was suddenly blocked. Two massive men in custom-tailored dark suits stepped right in front of me. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid wall of muscle. They were not hospital security. They had earpieces and a ruthless military demeanor. Private security. I tried to step around them, but the larger of the two put a heavy hand directly on my chest, shoving me back. He told me the room was restricted. I slapped his hand away. I yelled that my son was in that room and no one was going to keep me from him. I demanded they move out of my way before I moved them myself. The commotion echoed down the quiet hospital hallway. Nurses began to peek out of nearby rooms, and then the door to the ICU suite slowly opened. Out stepped Chloe. She looked like she had just stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. She wore a pristine black designer coat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her makeup was flawless. There was not a single wrinkle in her clothes. And more importantly, there was not a single tear in her eyes. Not a trace of redness. Not a hint of grief. Her husband, my son, had supposedly just suffered a massive heart attack, and she looked like she was waiting for a table at an upscale brunch. She looked down at my grease-stained jacket. She looked at my scuffed steel toe boots. Her lip curled upward in a sneer of absolute disdain. She looked at her security guards and spoke in a voice so cold it could freeze boiling water. She said, "He has no place here." I stared at her, a mind struggling to process the sheer cruelty of her words. I asked her what she was talking about. I told her to call off her goons so I could see my son. Chloe crossed her arms and let out a short, irritated sigh. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the blow that shattered my universe into a million pieces. She told me I was too late. She said David had passed away an hour ago. The hallway spun around me. My knees buckled. I reached out and grabbed the edge of a medical cart just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. My son. My beautiful, brilliant boy. Gone. I felt a sob rip through my throat, a sound of pure, primal agony that tore from the deepest part of my soul. I lunged forward, desperate to get into the room just to touch his face, just to say goodbye. But the two guards shoved me backward again, hitting me so hard I stumbled against the wall. I begged her. I am not ashamed to admit it. A 65-year-old man crying and pleading in a hospital hallway. I begged Chloe to let me see him. I told her he was my flesh and blood. I told her I was his father. Chloe did not even blink. She pulled out a legal document from her designer handbag. She told me she was his legally documented next of kin. She said she had full authority over his remains and his hospital room, and she explicitly forbid me from entering. She said my presence was causing a disturbance, and that David would not have wanted a scene. She was erasing my 40 years of fatherhood with a single piece of paper. The grief inside me instantly transmuted into a blinding white-hot rage. I stepped up to the guards, pointing a trembling finger right at Chloe's flawless face. I screamed at the top of my lungs. I asked her how dare she keep me from my son. I reminded her of who I was and where David came from. I shouted that she was standing there, wearing clothes bought with his money, acting like royalty, when I was the one who mortgaged my only home to fund the very startup that made him rich. I told her I bled for that boy, that I worked double shifts loading freight while she was taking vacations on her father's yacht. I yelled that she never loved him, that she only ever loved his bank account. The nurses at the station were watching in stunned silence. A doctor stepped out, looking alarmed. But Chloe did not flinch. She simply rolled her eyes, treating my agony like a minor inconvenience. She turned completely away from me. A sleek corporate assistant hurried up to her side carrying a small plastic hospital bag. Inside that bag, I could see David's personal effects. His silver watch, his wallet, his wedding ring. Chloe did not even look at the items. She just waved her hand and told the assistant to take it all to the car. She treated the last remnants of my son's life like discarded trash. She looked back at me one last time. She told the guards to get rid of the nuisance. Before I could throw another punch or scream another word, the two massive security guards grabbed me. One pinned my arms behind my back, and the other grabbed me by the collar of my jacket. They dragged me backward down the hallway. I fought. I kicked. I screamed David's name until my vocal cords bled. But I was a tired old man against two professional muscle men. They hauled me into the elevator, marched me through the crowded main lobby like a common criminal, and threw me out the front doors into the humid Atlanta morning. I hit the concrete pavement hard, scraping my hands and knees. I sat there on the hot pavement, watching the automatic doors slide shut. The sun was fully up now, blinding and bright, but my world had never been darker. My son was dead. The woman who had isolated him from me was now sitting on a $43 million empire. She had barred me from his deathbed. She had treated me like a stray dog. As I slowly pulled myself up from the concrete, wiping the dirt from my hands, the devastating reality washed over me. I had absolutely nothing. I was in a strange city, locked out of my son's life with no power, no money, and no legal rights. But as the tears streamed down my face, an undeniable fire ignited in the center of my chest. I wiped my eyes. Chloe thought I was just an ignorant working-class old man she could easily brush aside. She thought her money and her elite status made her invincible. She had no idea that a man who has lost his entire world is the most dangerous force on earth. And she was about to learn that you never, ever back a desperate father into a corner. 3 days went by in a blur of heavy silence and suffocating grief. When the day of the funeral finally arrived, I pulled up to a place that felt like another planet. Chloe did not bury my son in a church that knew the sound of a real choir or the warmth of a true congregation. She orchestrated a media event at an ultra-exclusive country club chapel in one of the wealthiest zip codes in Atlanta. The parking lot was a sea of black luxury vehicles, imported sports cars, and private security details. Photographers from business magazines were actually gathered near the wrought iron gates, snapping pictures as the city elite walked inside. My son built a medical software empire from the ground up, but this was not his world. David was a boy who grew up eating grits at my kitchen table in Chicago, a boy who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. This sterile, polished spectacle was entirely Chloe. I walked up the stone steps wearing my best dark suit. It was the only suit I owned, bought 10 years ago, but I had ironed it until the creases were sharp. I wanted to look dignified for my boy. As soon as I crossed the heavy oak doors, the air conditioning hit me like a blast from a freezer. The sanctuary was massive, adorned with thousands of white lilies that smelled more like a high-end perfume counter than a memorial. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers. It felt staged. It felt empty. I looked down the long carpeted aisle toward the mahogany casket at the front, my heart shattering all over again. I took a step forward, intending to walk up to the front row, the place where a father belongs when he is saying goodbye to his only child. Before I could take 3 steps, 2 young ushers in tailored suits intercepted me. They did not offer condolences. They did not look me in the eye with any trace of sympathy. One of them held up a laminated seating chart, glanced at my face, and politely but firmly blocked my path. He told me that the front rows were strictly reserved for the widow, her immediate family, and the corporate board of directors. I stared at him, my jaw tight. I told him I was David's father. I told him my blood was in that casket. The usher gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile and said he was just following Mrs. Sterling's direct orders. He pointed toward the very back of the massive chapel, gesturing to a section of folding chairs set up behind the polished wooden pews. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to shove past them. I wanted to march down that aisle, grab a microphone, and demand the respect owed to the man who raised the deceased. My fists clenched at my sides. The blood pounded in my ears, but then I looked at the polished mahogany box resting at the altar. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. David hated public scenes. He was a man of peace, a man who always tried to smooth over the rough edges of any conflict. If I started a brawl in the middle of his memorial, I would be dishonoring his memory. I had to swallow my pride. I had to endure this humiliation for his sake. I let the ushers escort me to the very last row in the dark corner of the chapel. I sat down on a hard metal chair. I looked around and realized who I was seated with. These were not family members or close friends. They were the entry-level interns from David's company. Young kids in cheap suits looking at their phones, whispering to each other, completely disconnected from the gravity of the day. I was cast aside, shoved into the shadows, rendered entirely invisible at my own son's funeral. Then Chloe made her grand entrance. She walked down the aisle dressed in custom black couture, her face covered by a delicate lace veil. She clung to the arm of her brother Bradley, a smug, arrogant man who had always treated David like a walking bank account. The cameras flashed. Chloe paused right in front of the photographers. She pressed a pristine white handkerchief to her dry eyes, her shoulders shaking in a perfectly timed performance of a grieving widow. It was flawless. It was sickening. She gave the cameras exactly what they wanted, the tragic narrative of a high society wife losing her brilliant husband. Not once did she look back. Not once did she search the room for the man who brought David into this world. I sat in the shadows, my chest aching with a pain so deep it felt like my ribs were cracking. I watched strangers deliver eulogies about a corporate titan they barely knew. They talked about profit margins, market shares, and visionary leadership. Nobody talked about the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I watched the evening news. Nobody talked about the son who called me every Sunday morning just to hear my voice. When the service finally ended, the crowd moved to the private cemetery on the country club grounds. I stood at the very edge of the crowd, separated from the graveside by rows of wealthy strangers and private security. I watched the polished mahogany casket lower into the ground from a distance. The cold rain began to fall, a slow, freezing drizzle that soaked right through my suit jacket. I stood there until the very last guest went back to their warm, luxury cars, until Chloe and her entourage disappeared into the fleet of black SUVs to attend the catered reception I was explicitly not invited to. I stood alone in the rain, staring at the fresh earth, whispering my final goodbyes to my boy. By the time I walked back to my beat-up truck, I was shivering. The cold was settling deep into my bones, but the emotional exhaustion was far heavier. I could not go back to my cheap motel room. The walls would close in on me. I needed to feel connected to David. I needed to be somewhere that actually held his memory away from the cameras and the fake tears. I started the engine, turned the heater on high, and drove toward the upscale suburban neighborhood where David owned a beautiful 2-story townhouse. This was not the mega mansion he shared with Chloe later on. This was the first real home David ever bought. We found it together right after his company secured its first round of funding. He was short on the credit history required for the mortgage, so I co-signed the loan with him. I took all the risk because I believed in his dream. We spent 3 weeks painting the walls ourselves, eating takeout pizza on the bare floorboards, laughing and talking about the future. His old study was in that house. It was a room filled with his college textbooks, his early sketches, and the worn leather chair he loved so much. I just wanted to sit in that chair for an hour. I wanted to close my eyes and feel close to him one last time. The rain was coming down harder by the time I pulled into the quiet, tree-lined street. I parked my truck by the curb and walked up the paved driveway. The house looked exactly as I remembered it. The dark blue shutters, the wide front porch, the sturdy oak door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keychain. I still had the original brass key David gave me the day we finished painting the study. He handed it to me and said I would always have a place there no matter how big his company grew. I stepped up onto the porch, wiping the rain from my face, and slid the key into the deadbolt. I turned it to the right. It stopped. It did not click. The cylinder was completely jammed. I pulled the key out, wiped the water off it, and tried again. I jiggled the handle. I pushed my weight against the heavy wood. Nothing moved. The key would not turn. A sudden wave of confusion washed over me quickly, followed by a sickening realization. The lock was brand new. The brass around the keyhole was gleaming free of any scratches. The locks had been completely changed. Before I could even process the insult, the heavy oak door swung open from the inside. Standing in the doorway was Bradley, Chloe's brother. He was wearing a sharp, expensive suit, holding a steaming mug of coffee, and looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. The warm light from the hallway spilled out onto the porch, highlighting the smug twist of his lips. I asked him what he was doing in my son's house. I demanded to know why my key was not working. Bradley took a slow sip of his coffee, completely unfazed by my anger. He smiled and said he was just doing a little inventory. He told me the house did not belong to David anymore. He casually informed me that it belonged to his sister. He said Chloe was the sole trustee of the estate now, and she had asked him to secure all the properties. I felt the heat rising in my neck. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I told him I co-signed the mortgage on this house. I told him this was my son's private sanctuary, and he had no right to step foot inside it. I demanded he step aside so I could go into the study. Bradley did not move. Instead, he let out a short, condescending laugh. He told me my name might have been on the original loan, but David paid it off years ago, transferring the deed completely into a marital trust. He said I was nothing more than a trespasser standing on private property. I raised my voice over the sound of the pouring rain. I told him I did not care about the trust or the deed. I told him I just buried my only son 2 hours ago, and I was going to walk into that study to mourn him, whether Bradley liked it or not. I took another heavy step toward the threshold. That was when Bradley took a deliberate step back into the foyer and whistled over his shoulder. The sound cut through the heavy air. From the shadows of the living room, two uniformed Atlanta police officers stepped right into the light. Their hands rested casually on their duty belts. They looked at my soaked, worn-out suit, my scuffed work boots, and my clenched fists. They looked at Bradley, who was standing there sipping premium coffee in a tailored suit. It was immediately clear whose side they were prepared to take. Bradley pulled a folded, officially stamped document from his breast pocket and handed it to the taller officer. He spoke in a calm, authoritative tone, the tone of a man who owned the city. He told the officers that I was an estranged, aggressive relative who was harassing his family on the day of the funeral. He pointed directly at my chest and declared that I was trespassing on property owned exclusively by Chloe's legal trust. He demanded that I be removed from the premises immediately. The taller officer stepped out onto the porch, placing his body squarely between me and the doorway. He looked at me with a stern, warning glare. He told me I needed to step back. He said the property owner had presented valid documentation establishing sole ownership. He ordered me to leave the premises immediately, warning me that if I took one more step toward the door, I would be placed under arrest for criminal trespassing and harassment. I stood there frozen in the freezing rain, staring at the two armed officers and the arrogant, grinning face of the man standing inside my son's home. The injustice of it all threatened to tear me apart. I wanted to fight. I wanted to tear through those officers and drag Bradley out by his expensive silk tie. I wanted to shatter the windows and break down the doors of the house I helped build. The anger surging through my veins was blinding, reckless, and desperate. But then I looked at the officers' hands resting near their weapons. I remembered the reality of the world I lived in. I was a 65-year-old black man standing on the porch of a multi-million-dollar property in a wealthy neighborhood, aggressively confronting a man who held a court-stamped document. If I threw a punch, I would not just be arrested. I would be locked away in a cell, branded a violent criminal, and completely stripped of any chance to fight for my son's legacy. Chloe would win instantly. She would have the perfect excuse to silence me forever. I had to swallow the bile rising in my throat. I had to bite my tongue until I tasted blood. I looked directly into Bradley's eyes, burning the image of his smug smile into my memory. I told him quietly that this was not over. Bradley just chuckled, took another sip of his coffee, and slowly closed the heavy oak door right in my face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final sound. I turned around and walked slowly down the wet driveway. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets now, washing over my face, mixing with the tears I could no longer hold back. My heavy boots splashed through the deep puddles on the street. I reached my old truck, yanked the door open, and climbed inside the cold, dark cabin. I slammed the door shut and gripped the steering wheel with both hands, my knuckles turning white. I sat in the freezing truck, listening to the rain hammer violently against the metal roof. I stared through the fogged-up windshield at the glowing windows of the townhouse. Inside, strangers were walking through my son's memories, taking inventory of his life, claiming everything he had worked so hard to build. They had locked me out of the hospital room. They had shoved me into the back corner of his funeral. They had thrown me off his property under the threat of arrest. As the cold air seeped through my soaked clothes, the heavy fog of grief began to lift, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. This was too clean. The locked doors, the immediate court, documents, the police waiting in the living room, just hours after the burial. Grieving widows do not operate with this kind of ruthless, calculated efficiency. People in mourning do not instantly deploy private security and secure real estate deeds before the dirt on the grave has even settled. I realized right then and there, staring through the rain, that my son's death was not a sudden, tragic medical failure. It was a well-planned, meticulously executed maneuver. I was not just a grieving father mourning a terrible loss. I was a target who had been deliberately neutralized. The woman my son married had not just lost a husband. She had executed a hostile takeover of a $43 million empire, and she was systematically erasing me from the equation to ensure there were no loose ends. The grief in my heart solidified into cold, unbreakable steel. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I was going to find out exactly what Chloe had done to my boy, and I was going to tear her stolen empire down to the studs. The summons came through a courier early Monday morning, wrapped in a heavy cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of my son's corporate legal firm. I was instructed to appear at a downtown Atlanta high-rise for the official reading of David's last will and testament. I put on my navy blue Sunday suit. It was the same suit I had worn to church back in Chicago for the past 10 years. The fabric was worn at the elbows, but I spent an hour ironing every crease until it was sharp enough to cut paper. I polished my shoes until they reflected the dim light of my cheap motel room. I was not a wealthy man. I did not belong in the towering glass castles of the financial district. But I was David's father, and I was going to walk into that building with my head held high, carrying the pride of a man who had earned every gray hair on his head. The taxi dropped me off in front of a massive skyscraper that seemed to pierce the morning clouds. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and stainless steel. Men and women in $1,000 suits hurried past me holding briefcases and speaking quickly into their phones. I stepped into the elevator feeling the sheer speed of it pressing me down as it clomped 50 stories into the sky. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the reception area of Harrison & Associates. It was a space designed to intimidate. The walls were lined with dark cherry wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the sprawling Atlanta metropolis. A receptionist with a polite, practiced smile escorted me down a long corridor. We entered a massive boardroom dominated by a custom mahogany table that looked long enough to seat 20 people. Standing at the far end of the room was Harrison. He was an older white gentleman with silver hair wearing a classic tweed suit that felt out of place in this hyper-modern office. Harrison had been David's primary counsel for years. He was an old-school lawyer, a man who still believed in a firm handshake and looking a person in the eye. When he saw me, he did not offer a tight corporate smile. His eyes were red-rimmed, carrying genuine sorrow. He walked the length of the room and extended his hand. He told me that David was one of the finest men he had ever known, and that working by his side had been the greatest honor of his career. I shook his hand firmly, feeling a brief, rare moment of comfort. Harrison actually loved my boy. Before we could speak further, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chloe walked in. She was no longer playing the part of the weeping, devastated widow from the country club funeral. Today, she was dressed for war. She wore a tailored charcoal power suit, her blonde hair pulled back tightly. Around her neck, she wore a diamond pendant that David had bought her for their first anniversary. Flanking her on either side were 3 attorneys. They were young, slick, and moved with a calculated, predatory rhythm. They carried thick leather briefcases and wore expressions of absolute arrogance. They did not look like men gathered to honor a deceased client. They looked like an execution squad preparing to divide the spoils. Chloe did not look at me. She did not offer a greeting. She walked directly to the center of the table and took the dominant seat, pulling out a slim tablet and placing it on the polished wood. Her lawyers fanned out around her, sitting down in unison. I took my seat directly across from her, resting my calloused hands on the table. I watched them closely. After 40 years of managing chaotic rail yards, you learn how to read people. You learn how to spot a hazard before it derails the whole train. Chloe and her team were practically buzzing with a toxic, triumphant energy. They thought they had already won. Harrison took his place at the head of the table. He opened a thick manila folder and cleared his throat, attempting to establish a tone of dignity and respect. He stated that we were gathered to review the final estate documents of David, a man whose passing was a profound loss to everyone in the room. Chloe did not even let him finish his sentence. She raised a perfectly manicured hand and waved it dismissively in the air. She told Harrison to skip the sentimental formalities. She said she had a company to run, board members to calm down, and a media crisis to manage. She instructed her lead lawyer to take over the proceeding immediately. The lawyer on her right, a man with cold, flat eyes, opened his briefcase. He pulled out a bound document and slid it to the center of the table. He spoke in a rapid, robotic tone designed to confuse and overwhelm. He stated that this was the legally binding last will and testament drafted and notarized shortly after David and Chloe were married. According to the standard provisions of the document, in the event of David's untimely passing, all marital assets, corporate holdings, offshore accounts, real estate properties, and voting shares in the medical software company were to be transferred fully and exclusively to his surviving spouse. I sat completely still, listening to the legal jargon flying across the room. $43 million. A global medical tech firm. Properties across the country. All of it was being handed over to a woman who had barred me from my son's hospital room and had me thrown off his front porch by the police. The lawyers listed the assets one by one, treating my son's life work, his brilliant mind, his sleepless nights like items on a grocery receipt. They spoke of liquidating stocks, consolidating portfolios, and restructuring executive boards. I did not care about the money. I never cared about the money. I was a man who lived perfectly fine on coffee, hard work, and the satisfaction of a job well done. I never asked David for a single dime when he made his millions. I only wanted him to be happy. I only wanted to know my boy was safe. But sitting there watching these corporate vultures tear apart his legacy, a deep, sickening realization washed over me. Chloe was not going to honor his memory. She was going to erase it. She was going to consume his empire and wipe away everything that made David who he was. When the lawyer finally stopped reading, the room fell into a heavy silence. Chloe leaned back in her expensive leather chair. She crossed her arms and looked at me for the first time since she walked into the room. A slow, deeply condescending smirk spread across her face. It was the look of a victor gloating over a defeated enemy. She had all the power, all the wealth, and all the legal backing in the world. She thought I was nothing more than an uneducated relic from the Chicago slums, a nuisance to be swatted away. She nodded to her lead attorney. The man reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the long mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my hands. I looked down at the document. The bold letters at the top read, "Waiver and relinquishment of all claims." Next to the paper, the lawyer placed a heavy silver fountain pen. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass. The smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, predatory arrogance. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice dripping with venom, thinly disguised as pity. She told me that David loved me, but he knew I could not handle this world. She said the corporate sphere, the millions of dollars, the high-stakes negotiations, were simply too complicated for a retired railroad dispatcher to comprehend. She told me I was out of my depth, completely unequipped to deal with the reality of his estate. She said my presence here was an unnecessary complication for her legal team and an embarrassment to David's high society reputation. Then she delivered the ultimate insult. She pointed to the silver pen. "Sign this waiver relinquishing any right to contest the estate," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Sign away any legal claim you think you might have. If you do that quietly, without making a scene, I will be generous enough to give you a $500 monthly stipend out of my personal account." $500, a monthly tip to keep my mouth shut, a payoff to disappear into the shadows and never speak my son's name again. She was offering me the equivalent of spare change from a $43 million fortune that my own blood sweat and sacrifices had helped build. I was the one who worked 20-hour shifts to buy David his first computer. I was the one who sold everything I owned to fund his vision when the banks laughed in his face. And this woman who had done nothing but leech off his success was now offering me an allowance to go away and die quietly. The silence in the boardroom became deafening. The blood rushed to my head so fast it made my ears ring. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, suffocating. I looked down at the silver pen resting on the table. I looked at the waiver filled with legal traps designed to strip me of my last shred of dignity. Then I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with Chloe. She stared back, utterly confident, waiting for the broken, grieving old man to submit to her power. Her 3 lawyers sat perfectly still, watching me like hawks, waiting for me to surrender. A terrible white-hot fire ignited in my chest. It was a rage so pure and concentrated that it burned away every trace of exhaustion and grief I had been carrying for the past week. I was not going to submit. I was not going to take her pathetic bribe. I reached out with my right hand and wrapped my calloused, scarred fingers around the heavy silver pen. Chloe smiled, thinking she had won, but I did not move the pen toward the signature line. I gripped the silver barrel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My muscles tensed, coiled like a spring ready to snap. I was going to drive that pen straight through the center of her insulting document. I was going to tear the waiver into 100 pieces, throw the shredded paper right into her arrogant face, and declare an absolute scorched earth war against her and her entire bloodline. I was prepared to spend every remaining breath in my lungs, fighting her in every courtroom in the country, even if it cost me my life. I lifted the pen high above the table, my jaw locked, my eyes blazing with a fury that made her smirk falter for the first time. The lawyers flinched, shifting in their seats as they realized I was not surrendering. I braced myself to strike the paper. Just as the metal tip was about to shatter the document, a sudden explosive sound shattered the tension in the room. Harrison sprang out of his chair at the head of the table. He brought his open palm crashing down onto the solid mahogany surface with a force that sounded like a gunshot. The impact rattled the coffee cups and echoed off the floor to ceiling windows. "Stop!" Harrison shouted, his voice booming with unexpected, absolute authority. The sharp, commanding echo of Harrison's voice slammed against the glass walls of the boardroom, freezing every person in their tracks. The heavy silver pen, hovering just inches above the surrender waiver, slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the polished mahogany table. Chloe's lead attorney flinched his posture, snapping backward as if he had been physically struck. Chloe herself blinked her condescending smirk, faltering into a mask of pure, irritated confusion. For a moment, the only sound in that sprawling, high-rise office was the rapid thumping of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Harrison did not look at the team of corporate sharks sitting across from him. He kept his eyes locked squarely on me. The old lawyer's face was pale, his jaw set with a rigid, uncompromising determination that I had never seen before. He took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the lapels of his tweed suit, shedding the polite corporate neutrality he had maintained since we walked into the room. He was no longer just an estate executor facilitating a legal transfer. He was a man carrying a terrible, heavy burden. Without saying another word, Harrison turned his back to the table and walked toward a massive dark oak credenza situated against the far wall. Chloe immediately scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated annoyance. She asked Harrison what on earth he was doing, reminding him in a sharp, clipped tone that they had an aggressive schedule and media briefings to attend. She demanded he sit back down and finish processing the asset transfer. Harrison ignored her completely. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small antique brass key on a simple leather lanyard. He inserted the key into a discreet lock at the bottom of the credenza. The heavy drawer slid open with a smooth metallic glide. Harrison reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was not a standard manila folder. It was made of heavy cream-colored parchment, secured at the back with a thick puddle of dark red sealing wax. My breath caught in my throat. Even from across the long table, I recognized the bold, slanted handwriting scrawled across the front of the envelope. It was David's handwriting. Harrison walked slowly back to the head of the table, holding the envelope with both hands, as if it were a fragile, sacred artifact. He placed it gently on the glass surface. Chloe leaned forward, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in a tight, suspicious frown. She asked what that document was, asserting that her legal team had already thoroughly reviewed every codicil trust and amendment attached to her late husband's estate. Her lead attorney chimed in, adjusting his glasses, stating that any hidden documents not properly filed in the probate registry were legally void and inadmissible in this proceeding. Harrison planted his hands firmly on the table and leaned over them, projecting a commanding absolute authority that silenced the younger lawyers instantly. He stated that the envelope was not a legal codicil or an amendment to the marital trust. He explained that David had come into this very office exactly 3 weeks before his sudden death. David had handed him this sealed envelope with a set of incredibly strict, non-negotiable instructions. Harrison's voice thickened with raw emotion as he looked directly into my eyes. He said David commanded him to keep this document hidden from everyone, especially his wife and her legal representatives. The envelope was only to be brought out and opened under one specific absolute condition. It was only to be read aloud if his father Tyrone was physically sitting at this table. Chloe's face drained of color. The arrogant, untouchable glow that had surrounded her since the funeral completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged flash of panic. She slammed her hand on the desk, her diamond rings clinking sharply against the wood. She ordered her lawyers to object. She declared that her husband had been suffering from severe mental fatigue and paranoia in his final weeks, claiming that whatever was in that envelope was the product of a deteriorating mind. She demanded that Harrison hand the document over to her immediately as the legal next of kin. Harrison did not even flinch. He told Chloe that as long as he was the managing partner of this firm, he would execute his client's final wishes exactly as they were given. He picked up a silver letter opener from his desk organizer. The room went dead silent. The 3 corporate attorneys sitting next to Chloe exchanged nervous, uncertain glances, realizing that the narrative they had so carefully constructed was about to be derailed. With a swift, clean motion, Harrison slid the blade under the flap of the envelope, snapping the red wax seal. The sound of the tearing paper seemed to echo like thunder. He pulled out 2 sheets of premium stationery covered entirely in David's handwriting. The script was not the confident, sweeping penmanship of a multi-million-dollar software CEO. It was shaky, jagged, and rushed. It looked like the handwriting of a man who was terrified. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses, and began to read my son's final words aloud. The letter started with me. Harrison read David's words, thanking me for every sacrifice I had ever made. David wrote about the freezing Chicago mornings, watching me lace up my steel toe boots to go work a double shift at the rail yard so he could have new textbooks. He wrote about the day I marched into the bank and mortgaged the house, putting my entire livelihood on the line because I believed in a young black kid with a dream. Hearing my boy's voice coming through Harrison's solemn delivery broke down the walls I had built around my heart. The tears I had been fighting back since the hospital finally spilled over, rolling silently down my weathered cheeks. David wrote that he loved me more than life itself, and his greatest regret was letting the toxic high society world he married into pull him away from the only man who ever truly had his back. But then Harrison paused. He took a sharp, unsteady breath, and the tone of the letter abruptly shifted from a loving farewell into a desperate, chilling warning. David's words cut through the silence of the boardroom like a scythe. Harrison read the next paragraph, where David explicitly stated that if this letter was being opened, it meant the worst had happened. It meant he was dead. David wrote that Chloe was not the supportive, loving partner she pretended to be in front of the cameras. He detailed how he had recently hired a private forensic auditor after noticing massive, unexplained discrepancies in the company's offshore expansion funds. He had discovered that Chloe was secretly gutting the medical software company from the inside out. She was funneling millions of dollars into shell corporations linked directly to the CEO of his largest tech rival. She was actively orchestrating a hostile takeover, preparing to sell his life's work for pennies on the dollar the moment he was out of the picture. Chloe shot up from her chair. Her chair tipped backward and crashed heavily onto the floor. She screamed that it was a lie, waving her arms frantically. She yelled that David was hallucinating, that the stress of the tech industry had triggered a psychotic break. She ordered her lead lawyer to shut Harrison up, demanding an immediate court injunction to strike the reading from the record. Her lawyers scrambled, trying to find a legal precedent to intervene, but Harrison raised his voice, drowning out her frantic shrieks. He continued reading the letter, moving to the final, most horrifying revelation. David's written words described a sudden, terrifying decline in his health over the past month. He wrote about extreme dizzy spells, a racing heart, and shortness of breath that struck him every morning right after he took his prescribed blood pressure medication. He detailed how he had caught Chloe standing in the kitchen late one night holding his pill bottles, her expression cold and entirely detached. David wrote that he had secretly skipped a dose and immediately felt his strength returning, only to feel his chest seizing up again the next time she personally handed him his medication with a glass of water. Harrison's voice dropped to a near whisper, reading the most devastating sentence my ears had ever heard. David wrote, "Dad, she is swapping my pills. I am being poisoned in my own home. I am trying to gather enough concrete proof to go to the federal authorities without triggering her to act faster. But I am so weak. If I die of a sudden heart attack, do not let them tell you it was natural. It was not stress. It was murder." A suffocating, heavy dread settled over my entire body. I stopped breathing. The sterile, polished walls of the boardroom seemed to close in around me. My son had not just collapsed from exhaustion. He had been hunted. He had been trapped in his own mansion, slowly and methodically poisoned by the woman who smiled for the cameras and slept in his bed. He had spent his final days terrified, isolated, and fighting just to stay conscious long enough to leave me a trail to the truth. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Chloe had banned me from the ICU, not out of grief, but because she needed to ensure I did not ask the doctors the wrong questions. She needed to control the medical narrative, ensuring the death was ruled a tragic cardiovascular event, before anyone could request a toxicology report. Harrison swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he read the very last lines of the letter. David's final instruction was not a plea for mourning. It was a call to war. Harrison read, "Dad, I managed to secure the physical evidence of the financial treason and the footage from the hidden cameras I installed in the house. I could not keep it here. She searches my office every night. You are the only person on earth who will understand this clue. Find locker 402. Take what is inside to the authorities. Do not let her win. I love you." Harrison slowly lowered the pages. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and toxic. I stared across the mahogany table at Chloe. The pristine, untouchable facade of the billionaire widow had completely disintegrated. Her face was the color of chalk. Her chest heaved rapidly, her manicured hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the glass table just to keep herself standing. She was no longer a grieving wife. She was a cornered animal whose trap had just been sprung. Then she turned feral. Chloe unleashed a piercing, unhinged scream that echoed down the long corporate hallway outside. She swept her arm violently across the table, knocking a heavy crystal water pitcher onto the floor. The pitcher shattered into 100 pieces, sending water and glass flying across the expensive carpet. She pointed a shaking, manic finger directly at Harrison, her voice cracking, as she shrieked that the letter was an absolute fabrication. She accused Harrison of conspiring with a jealous, impoverished old man to steal her rightful inheritance. She screamed that David was a paranoid schizophrenic who had lost his mind, and she threatened to ruin Harrison's life. She swore she would have his law license permanently revoked, sue his firm into bankruptcy, and bury him under so many defamation lawsuits he would never see the light of day again. Her 3 attorneys were in a state of sheer panic. The lead lawyer grabbed Chloe by the arm urgently, whispering in her ear, trying to pull her away from the table. They knew that an allegation of first-degree murder combined with massive corporate fraud had just turned this routine estate settlement into a federal criminal nightmare. They needed to get their client out of that room before she incriminated herself any further. Chloe ripped her arm away from her lawyer's grip. She realized with terrifying clarity that she could no longer control the narrative inside this boardroom. Harrison was not going to bend to her threats, and I was not going to take her pathetic bribe. She locked eyes with me one last time. Behind the panic, I saw the cold, ruthless calculation of a predator adjusting its strategy. She knew she had lost the element of surprise, but she still had millions of dollars and a vast network of power at her disposal. She snatched her designer purse from the floor, turned on her heel, and stormed toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Her legal team scrambled to gather their briefcases and rushed out right behind her. As Chloe pushed violently through the doors, she was already digging her cell phone out of her bag. I heard her frantic, breathless voice echoing down the corridor as she dialed a number. She snapped into the phone, telling whoever was on the other end that they had a massive problem. She said the old man knew everything and gave a direct, chilling order to scrub everything immediately before I could find it. The heavy glass doors slowly swung shut, clicking back into place. The room fell into a stunned, ringing silence. Harrison slowly took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes with trembling fingers. He looked at me, a silent confirmation passing between us. My son was murdered, and the woman who did it was currently mobilizing every resource she had to destroy the evidence. I looked down at the mahogany table. I did not need to ask Harrison what the clue meant. I knew exactly what Locker 402 was. It was not a safety deposit box at a high-end bank. It was the rusted, battered metal locker I had used for 40 years at the abandoned Southside Chicago rail yard. It was the locker where I used to hide small birthday presents and comic books for David when he was a little boy visiting me on my lunch breaks. My son had driven all the way back to the rotting industrial heart of our hometown to hide the evidence where only his father would ever think to look. I stood up from my chair, my knees popping, the heavy weight of my age entirely vanishing under the adrenaline surging through my veins. Chloe had a head start. She had money lawyers and hired muscle, but she did not know the dark, freezing corners of the Chicago rail yards. I had only hours to get to that locker before her people tracked it down and destroyed the only proof of my son's murder. The grief had passed. The war had begun. The heavy glass doors of the downtown law firm clicked shut behind me, severing the tense silence of the boardroom from the chaotic hum of the city corridor. I stood by the elevators with a racing heart and a mind moving at 1,000 miles an hour. 402. The number bounced around my skull like a loose piece of gravel. It was not a bank vault. It was not a hidden safe deposit box in some high society financial district. Chloe and her high-paid lawyers were probably tearing apart every corporate ledger and banking registry in the state of Georgia right now looking for it. But they would never find it, because David did not hide his final message in their world. He hid it in ours. I pushed through the revolving doors of the high-rise and stepped out into the biting wind. The realization hit me with a profound, aching clarity. Locker 402. It was my very first dispatcher locker at the old South Side rail yard back in Chicago. That yard had been shut down and abandoned for over a decade, left to rust under the unforgiving city winters. But to David, it was a sacred place. When he was just a little boy, no taller than my waist, I used to bring him to work on Sunday mornings. He would sit on a wooden crate in the dispatcher office wearing a hard hat that was way too big for his head, drinking hot cocoa from a thermos, and watching the massive freight trains roll in. I used to hide his birthday presents and little treats inside Locker 402. He knew that battered metal box was our secret place. My son knew that when his life was on the line, the only man he could trust was his father, and the only place that was safe was the very foundation where we built our lives. I moved faster than I had in years. I hurried down the street, my chest tight with a mixture of overwhelming grief and a fiery, relentless determination. I hopped a flight back to Chicago, immediately spending the last bit of cash I had to my name. By the time I landed and retrieved my old pickup truck from the long-term lot, the afternoon sky was already turning a bruised, stormy purple. I turned the ignition, listening to the familiar rumble of the engine, and put the truck in gear. I headed straight for the south side. The drive down the Kennedy Expressway felt like a blur. My hands gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel. I kept replaying the horror of David's letter in my mind, the absolute evil of that woman slowly poisoning my boy in his own home. The anger was a living thing inside me, burning away the fatigue of my 65 years. I navigated the maze of decaying industrial streets, passing boarded-up factories and broken chain-link fences. The deeper I drove into the abandoned warehouse district, the quieter the roads became. I glanced up at my rearview mirror to check the blind spot, and my blood ran ice cold. About 3 blocks back, cutting through the thickening evening fog, was a massive black SUV. It had no front license plate and heavily tinted windows. I took a sudden sharp left turn onto a narrow side street littered with potholes. The SUV took the exact same turn. I sped up the tires of my truck, splashing through deep puddles of oily water. The black vehicle accelerated, closing the distance between us with aggressive, predatory speed. Chloe had not wasted a single second. She knew I had figured out the clue before she did. She must have had her people track my flight or ping my cell phone. And she sent her arrogant brother Bradley to clean up the mess. She sent hired muscle to make sure whatever was inside Locker 402 never saw the light of day. They thought they were hunting an easy target, a tired, broken old man who would simply surrender out of fear. But they were on my turf now. I slammed on the brakes as I approached the rusted iron gates of the abandoned South Side rail yard. The gate was secured with a heavy chain, but I knew this place like the back of my own hand. I threw the truck into park, leaving the keys in the ignition, and bolted out the door. The freezing wind whipped across my face as I squeezed through a gap in the bent iron fence. I plunged into the sprawling graveyard of forgotten steel. Behind me, I heard the screech of heavy tires skidding on wet gravel. The doors of the SUV slammed shut. Heavy footsteps crunched on the stones. I ducked behind a towering, rusted freight car, pressing my back against the freezing metal. I tried to control my breathing, My lungs burned and my knees ached, but adrenaline pumped through my veins. I peered around the edge of the train car. There were 3 of them. Bradley was in the center wearing an expensive dark trench coat that looked ridiculous in the grime of the rail yard. Flanking him were 2 massive, thick-necked men wearing tactical jackets. They looked like professional enforcers, the kind of men who broke bones for a living and never asked questions. One of them pulled a heavy flashlight from his belt, the harsh white beam cutting through the fog. I moved silently, slipping between the shadows of the decaying train cars. The yard was a labyrinth of rusted metal, overgrown weeds, and forgotten machinery. For 40 years, I had walked these tracks. I knew every blind corner, every maintenance trench, and every hidden walkway. I could navigate this place blindfolded. I used the howling wind to mask the sound of my footsteps creeping closer and closer to the old dispatcher building at the far end of the yard. I could hear Bradley cursing as his expensive leather shoes slipped on the muddy tracks. He yelled at his men to spread out, telling them the old man could not have gone far. His voice dripped with that same repulsive arrogance his sister carried. He shouted into the darkness, telling me there was nowhere to run. He said I was making a huge mistake, that I should just hand over whatever Dave left behind and nobody had to get hurt. He promised me money. He promised me safety. The sheer audacity of his lies only fueled the fire in my chest. They murdered my son, and now they wanted to buy my silence in a graveyard of rust. I reached the heavy reinforced steel door of the dispatcher building. The lock had been broken off years ago by scavengers. I slipped inside, the familiar smell of damp concrete and old engine grease wrapping around me like a blanket. The main room was pitch black, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the cracked, grime-covered windows. I moved swiftly toward the back corridor, where the employee lockers were located. My boots barely made a sound on the concrete. I found the row of dented gray metal lockers lining the back wall. I ran my calloused fingers along the cold steel until I found the faded white numbers painted on the door. 402. A heavy brass padlock secured the latch. I reached into my pocket, my heart hammering, but before I could inspect the lock, the heavy steel door of the building crashed open. The harsh beam of a tactical flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. Heavy boots stomped onto the concrete floor. They had found me. The flashlight beam caught me standing right in front of the locker. Bradley stepped out of the shadows, breathing hard, his face twisted into a vicious, triumphant sneer. His 2 hired goons fanned out on either side of him, blocking the only exit. The larger man reached under his jacket, his hand resting menacingly on the grip of a holstered weapon. They had me completely boxed in. Bradley laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the bare walls. He told me I put up a good fight for an old man. He stepped closer, the arrogance radiating from him in waves. He looked at the rusted lockers, shaking his head in disgust. He said he could not believe David would hide a multi-million-dollar corporate secret in a garbage dump like this. He demanded I step away from the locker. He held out his hand, palm up, and ordered me to give him the key. He said Chloe was willing to let me walk away with my life if I cooperated right now. I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at the 2 massive enforcers blocking the door. I was 65 years old. My hair was gray. My body was worn down from decades of hard labor. They looked at me and saw a fragile, grieving victim, but they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot what a man who works with steel and iron for 40 years is truly capable of. They forgot that I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My son was dead. My world was gone. I was not going to let them destroy his final legacy. I did not have a key, but I did not need one. I slowly raised my hands, pretending to surrender. I took a step back, my shoulder brushing against an old metal workbench pushed against the wall. My eyes darted to the surface of the bench. Resting in the shadows, forgotten by the scrap metal thieves, was a solid cast iron train coupling rod. It was 3 feet long, thick as a baseball bat, and weighed a solid 15 pounds. Bradley smirked, taking another confident step forward, thinking I was giving up. He reached out to grab my collar. In one fluid explosive motion, I dropped my hands, grabbed the heavy iron coupling rod from the bench, and swung it with every ounce of strength left in my body. I did not aim for his head. I aimed low. The heavy iron rod cracked into Bradley's right kneecap with a sickening wet crunch. Bradley let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute agony. His leg buckled completely, folding backward at an unnatural angle. He collapsed onto the dirty concrete, clutching his knee, screaming and writhing in the dirt. His expensive trench coat soaked up the stagnant water on the floor. The 2 goons were completely stunned. They never expected the quiet old man to strike with such brutal, precise violence. That single second of hesitation was all I needed. I turned on my heel and swung the iron rod like a sledgehammer directly at the heavy brass padlock on locker 402. The metal sparked as the iron smashed into the lock. 1 strike. 2 strikes. The brittle, rusted shackle snapped completely and clattered onto the floor. I yanked the metal door open. Sitting on the top shelf, coated in a thin layer of dust, was a small black metal lockbox. I dropped the iron rod, snatched the box with both hands, and shoved it deep into the inside pocket of my jacket. Behind me, the larger enforcer snapped out of his shock. He roared in anger and pulled a heavy black handgun from his holster, racking the slide. The metallic click echoed sharply in the small room. He raised the weapon, pointing it directly at my back. But I knew this building. I knew the architecture of the old dispatch center. Just 3 feet to my left was a heavy iron grate set into the floor. It was the access hatch for the underground steam tunnels that connected to the main rail lines. I dove toward the floor, grabbing the rusted handle of the grate. I hauled it upward with a violent pull, ignoring the searing pain tearing through my shoulder. The heavy iron flipped open. I threw myself into the dark, narrow shaft, just as the deafening crack of a gunshot shattered the air. The bullet smashed into the concrete wall exactly where my head had been a fraction of a second, before showering me in sharp dust and stone fragments. I hit the dirt floor of the underground tunnel hard, rolling to absorb the impact. I scrambled to my feet, in the pitch-black darkness, clutching the metal lockbox tightly against my chest. Above me, I heard the men yelling, their heavy boots stomping around the open hatch. A flashlight beam pierced the darkness, searching frantically for me, but the tunnel curved sharply just 10 feet from the drop. I did not look back. I ran. I ran through the cold, damp subterranean passage, guided only by memory and the fierce, burning spirit of my son pushing me forward. The sounds of their angry shouts grew fainter and fainter, swallowed by the thick concrete walls of the underground labyrinth. I emerged 3 blocks away, climbing out of a drainage culvert into a deserted alleyway. The freezing Chicago rain washed over my face as I stood in the shadows, panting, clutching the box that held the truth. I had survived the hunt. Now it was my turn to become the hunter. I pulled my battered truck into the dimly lit parking lot of a crumbling public library on the edge of the city limits. The rain was still coming down in thick, freezing sheets. My clothes were soaked through with tunnel water and grime from the rail yard. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, holding the small black metal lockbox against my chest. My hands were covered in grease and dried blood from where I had scraped them in the underground shafts. But I did not feel the pain. The only thing I felt was the burning need to know what my boy had sacrificed his final days to protect. I grabbed a heavy flathead screwdriver from the floorboard of my truck. I wedged the steel tip right under the cheap metal latch of the lockbox, and pushed down with all the weight of my tired shoulders. The metal groaned and snapped. The lid popped open. Sitting inside, resting on a piece of folded velvet, was a single silver USB flash drive. Nothing else. No stacks of cash. No printed documents. Just a tiny piece of technology holding a secret worth $43 million. I tucked the drive into my pocket and stepped out into the storm. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the library. The place was nearly empty. A few night shift workers were sleeping in the corner armchairs. An elderly librarian barely looked up from her desk as I walked past. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, pale glow over the rows of dusty bookshelves. I found a secluded computer terminal tucked away in the back corner of the reference section. I pulled out the chair and sat down. My hands were shaking so violently, I dropped the flash drive twice before I finally managed to plug it into the computer port. A small folder icon popped up on the bright screen. I clicked on it. There were 4 video files inside. They were labeled by date. The dates matched the final 4 weeks of David's life. I clicked on the first file, and the screen went black for a second before snapping into crystal-clear, high-definition color. It was a wide-angle shot of David's sprawling living room in Atlanta. The camera was hidden perfectly. It looked like it was positioned somewhere inside the large oak bookshelf, facing the custom marble kitchen island and the velvet living room sofas. The timestamp in the corner showed it was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. David would have been at his corporate headquarters. The house was supposed to be empty, but it was not empty. Chloe walked into the frame. She was wearing a silk robe holding 2 crystal glasses of champagne. She was smiling. It was not the cold, calculating smile she gave me at the hospital. It was a wicked, triumphant grin. Following right behind her was a tall white man with slicked back hair and a tailored gray suit. I recognized his face instantly from the business magazines David used to proudly show me. His name was Preston. He was the chief executive officer of the exact rival medical tech firm that had been trying to buy David out for the past 3 years. David had refused every single offer because he wanted his technology to help low-income clinics, not just wealthy private hospitals. Preston wrapped his arms around Chloe from behind, kissing her neck. Chloe tilted her head back and laughed. It was a cruel, careless sound that made the bile rise in my throat. They sat down together at the marble kitchen island. I sat frozen in the hard wooden chair of the public library, unable to look away. I was watching the woman who vowed to love and protect my son, casually sipping champagne with his greatest enemy in the very house my son had purchased with his own sweat. But the absolute horror was only just beginning. Preston reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. He set it on the marble counter. Chloe picked it up and examined it against the light. She asked him if he was completely sure it would leave no trace. Preston smiled a shark-like grin. He told her the pills were a highly concentrated synthetic stimulant. He said when introduced into the bloodstream of a man already taking heavy blood pressure medication, the chemical reaction would trigger a massive, catastrophic cardiac failure. He assured her that to any standard medical examiner, it would look exactly like a severe stress-induced heart attack caused by overwork. Chloe did not show a single ounce of hesitation. She did not show a shred of guilt. She simply nodded and walked over to the kitchen cabinet where David kept his daily prescriptions. She brought his authentic pill bottle back to the island. I stopped breathing. The air in the library suddenly felt thick and suffocating. My chest tightened as I watched her empty David's life-saving medication into the garbage disposal. She turned on the faucet and washed his real pills down the drain. Then she opened the amber bottle Preston had brought. She poured the synthetic stimulants onto a marble cutting board. She took a heavy stainless steel muddler and began to crush the pills into a fine white powder. They were laughing. My son was being marked for a brutal, agonizing death, and the two people orchestrating it were sharing a joke about their upcoming vacation to the French Riviera. Preston leaned over the counter watching her work. He told her she needed to be precise. He said once David was out of the picture, the marital trust would automatically grant her full controlling shares of the $43 million software company. He laid out the rest of the plan with chilling corporate efficiency. He said the moment the funeral was over, Chloe would call an emergency board meeting. She would push through an immediate merger with his firm. He would absorb David's groundbreaking software, and Chloe would walk away with tens of millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts. Chloe carefully scooped the crushed white powder into empty gelatin capsules. She placed those poisoned capsules directly into David's authentic prescription bottle. She screwed the cap back on and placed it neatly back in the cabinet, right where my boy would reach for it the very next morning. She turned around, wrapped her arms around Preston, and kissed him. She whispered that she could not wait to be a wealthy widow. The video ended. The screen went black. I sat in the dim corner of the library, completely paralyzed. My hands gripped the edge of the computer desk so hard my knuckles were aching. A single tear rolled down my cheek, hitting the dirty keyboard. I had spent the last week drowning in a toxic sea of guilt. I had blamed myself for not calling enough. I had blamed the brutal stress of the tech industry. I had tortured my own soul, thinking my son simply worked himself to an early grave. But he had been hunted. My brilliant, kind-hearted boy had been slowly and methodically poisoned in his own kitchen by a woman who wanted to steal the empire he built from nothing. He had swallowed those pills, trusting his wife. He had felt his heart racing, his chest tightening, his breath failing. He had spent his final days trapped in a state of sheer terror, knowing something was deeply wrong, but not having the physical strength left to escape. The sorrow inside me burned away in a flash of blinding white-hot fury. The sadness was gone. Only a cold, ruthless determination remained. I pulled the flash drive out of the computer port and gripped it tightly in my fist. This tiny piece of plastic was the absolute proof of first-degree murder. It was the proof of a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy. It was the key to destroying Chloe and everyone who helped her. I was going to walk straight out of this library drive to the nearest Federal Bureau of Investigation field office and drop this evidence right on a federal agent's desk. I was going to watch them put Chloe in handcuffs and drag her away to spend the rest of her miserable life rotting in a concrete cell. I stood up from the computer terminal, pushing the chair back. I turned around and started walking down the main aisle toward the exit doors. My boots thumped heavily against the thin carpet. I felt taller. I felt a righteous strength filling my tired bones. I was a father walking to avenge his murdered son. But as I passed the large circulation desk near the front entrance, I glanced up. Mounted high on the wall above the librarian was a large flat-screen television. It was tuned to a 24-hour local news network. The volume was muted, but the bright flashing graphics demanded attention. I stopped dead in my tracks. Filling the entire television screen was Chloe. She was standing behind a podium surrounded by a sea of flashing cameras and news microphones. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress. Her hair was pulled back and her face was pale and blotchy, as if she had been crying for hours. Standing right behind her, looking grim and protective, was her brother Bradley. He was leaning heavily on a crutch, his right leg wrapped in a thick white medical cast from where I had shattered his knee with the iron rod just an hour ago. I stepped closer to the screen, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I could not hear her voice, but the closed captioning scrolling across the bottom of the screen spelled out her venomous lies word for word. She was looking directly into the cameras with wide, terrified eyes. The captions read that she was begging the public for help. She claimed that she and her family were living in a state of constant fear. She told the reporters that her father-in-law, a man named Tyrone, was deeply mentally unstable. She said I had been completely estranged from David for years because of my violent, unpredictable tendencies. She wove a masterful, terrifying web of complete fiction. She claimed that the moment David passed away, I had shown up in Atlanta, demanding tens of millions of dollars. She said when she politely refused to be extorted, I had completely lost my mind. The camera zoomed in on Bradley as he dramatically adjusted his crutch. Chloe wiped a fake tear from her cheek and told the press that I had ambushed her brother in a dark parking lot. She claimed I had brutally attacked him with a metal weapon, leaving him severely injured simply because he tried to protect her. She called me a dangerous, unhinged man who was heavily armed and seeking revenge against a grieving widow. My breath caught in my throat. I watched the screen in absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. She was turning the entire narrative upside down. She was painting the victim's father as a violent predator. Then the red breaking news ticker began to scroll across the bottom of the television screen. The bright white letters announced that a felony arrest warrant had just been issued for Tyrone. The police department considered me armed and extremely dangerous, but she did not stop there. The ticker tape revealed the true extent of her corporate power. Chloe's high-priced legal team had petitioned a superior court judge for an emergency injunction. They claimed I was attempting to drain David's estate and flee the jurisdiction. The judge had completely agreed with her. The news banner declared that all of my personal bank accounts, my retirement funds, my Social Security benefits, and even my meager checking account had been officially frozen by a federal court order. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I had exactly $12.50 in crumpled bills. That was it. That was my entire net worth at this exact moment. I looked around the quiet library. Suddenly, every single shadow felt like a trap. The elderly librarian at the front desk glanced up at the television screen and then looked down at me. I could see her eyes narrow behind her glasses. I was wearing the exact dark navy suit they were describing on the news broadcast. I was covered in dirt and tunnel grime, looking exactly like the desperate fugitive they were painting me out to be. I backed away from the desk, keeping my head down. My pulse pounded in my ears like a war drum. Chloe had outplayed me. While I was running through the mud of the rail yard securing the evidence, she was mobilizing a multi-million-dollar public relations and legal strike force. She knew she could not stop me from getting the flash drive, so she decided to destroy my credibility before I could even show it to anyone. If I walked into a police station right now, they would not look at my evidence. They would tackle me to the floor, put a knee in my back, and lock me in a holding cell for the violent assault on her brother. Any wild story I told about poisoned pills and corporate takeovers would be immediately dismissed as the ravings of the exact mentally unstable extortionist Chloe had just described on national television. She had built a perfect fortress of lies around the truth. I pushed through the sliding glass doors and walked back out into the freezing storm. I jogged to my truck, trying to keep my face hidden from the streetlights. I opened the door and climbed inside, locking it immediately. I sat in the darkness, shivering from the wet cold, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield. I was officially a hunted fugitive. The police were searching for me. The corporate security teams were searching for me. My money was completely gone. My reputation was destroyed. I had no home to return to, no safe harbor to hide in. I was entirely alone in a city that had just been told to fear me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive, holding it tight in my calloused palm. It was the only thing I had left in this world. Chloe thought she had stripped me of all my power. She thought by freezing my bank accounts and putting my face on the evening news, she had paralyzed me. But she forgot one crucial detail about men who spent their lives working in the grease and the cold. We do not need a lot of money to survive. We do not need public approval to do what is right. We only need a single solid point of leverage to tear a whole building down. She had won the battle in the media, but the war in the shadows was only just beginning. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the parking lot, vanishing into the dark, stormy streets. I was not going to the police. I was going to find the one man who could help me burn her empire to the ground. The flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars reflected in my rearview mirror long before they actually saw me. I pulled my battered truck into a dark, narrow alleyway behind an abandoned textile plant on the south side of Chicago. I turned off the engine and wiped down the steering wheel with a rag. That truck had been my reliable companion for 15 years, but right now it was a giant steel beacon announcing my exact location to every police officer in the city. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and slipped the small silver flash drive into my inner pocket. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked away into the freezing rain without looking back. I had exactly $12.50 to my name. I was a 65-year-old black man with an active felony warrant for my arrest. I was a father grieving the horrific murder of my only child. Every television screen in Chicago was painting me as a violent, unhinged criminal who had assaulted his own family for money. I knew the streets of this city well because I had worked them my entire life, but I had never walked them as a hunted man. I found shelter under the massive concrete belly of the Dan Ryan Expressway. It was a sprawling homeless encampment, representing a forgotten village of tents and shopping carts and burning trash barrels. I pulled my coat hood low over my face and sat on a discarded wooden pallet near the edge of the camp. The damp cold seeped through my jeans and bit deeply into my old bones. The acrid smell of wet wool and burning plastic filled my lungs with every breath. For the first 2 days, I survived on discarded bread crusts and half-eaten soup cans I found behind a local diner. My stomach cramped violently from the hunger, and my knees throbbed from sleeping on the damp pavement. I watched the city move around me from the shadows. I saw luxury cars drive past the overpass, splashing dirty water onto the curb. I thought about the $43 million empire my son had built from nothing. I thought about how he had wanted to change the world with his medical software. Now the man who had funded his very first computer was sitting in the mud, eating scraps like a stray dog. But I did not break. I did not shed another tear of self-pity. The freezing concrete under my boots did not bring me despair. Instead, it sharpened my mind into a deadly and intensely focused weapon. Chloe thought placing me in this gutter would completely silence me. She believed an old railroad worker stripped of his bank accounts and his dignity would just curl up and fade away into the background. She vastly underestimated the endurance of a father who had already survived a lifetime of hard labor. I sat by those burning barrels and mapped out my next move with absolute clarity. I was not going to hide in the dark forever. I was going to strike back and tear her world apart. I needed a way to communicate, but walking into a convenience store to buy a prepaid phone was completely impossible. My face was plastered all over the evening news broadcasts. On my third night in the encampment, I noticed a group of teenagers loitering near a gas station a few blocks away from the bridge. One of them had carelessly left a cheap plastic burner phone resting on a concrete planter while he argued loudly with his friends. I am not a thief. I have worked honestly for every single thing I have ever owned in my life. But my son was in the ground, murdered by a woman who was actively preparing to steal tens of millions of dollars. I walked past the concrete planter and swept the small phone into my palm without breaking my stride. I vanished back into the shadows of the overpass before the boy even realized it was gone. I crouched behind a thick concrete pillar and dialed the only phone number I knew by heart other than my own. I called the private direct office line of David's corporate attorney. The phone rang 4 times. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. If Harrison believed the media circus Chloe had manufactured over the past few days, he would immediately trace this call and send the police right to my location. The line clicked open. I spoke his name quietly into the receiver. I told him it was Tyrone. There was a heavy, profound silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Harrison breathing slowly. Then his voice came through completely steady and surprisingly calm. He did not ask if I had assaulted Bradley at the townhouse. He did not ask why I was running from the authorities. He simply asked where I was hiding. I told him I needed to see him in person, far away from the cameras and the corporate spies that Chloe employed. I gave him the address of a subterranean parking garage situated beneath a crumbling downtown shopping center. It was a neglected place where the security cameras had been broken for years. Harrison agreed immediately. He told me to be there exactly at midnight. The parking garage was a damp, echoing tomb of cracked concrete and flickering fluorescent lights. I stood in the deepest, darkest corner of the bottom level, watching the concrete entrance ramp. Exactly at midnight, a nondescript gray sedan rolled slowly down the ramp and parked facing the far wall. The headlights cut off. Harrison stepped out of the vehicle. He was wearing a dark, heavy overcoat with his silver hair catching the dim light of the garage. He looked physically exhausted, carrying the heavy burden of a man who had not slept in days. I stepped out of the shadows and approached the car. Harrison looked at my filthy clothes and my unshaven face and my trembling hands. He did not show a single ounce of pity or fear. He walked right up to me and extended his hand, grasping mine in a firm and solid grip. I asked him why he came. I asked him if he was afraid he was meeting a violent extortionist in the middle of the night. Harrison shook his head slowly. He looked me dead in the eye and said he had known David for a decade. He said he knew exactly the kind of honorable man who raised a son like that. Furthermore, Harrison told me that Chloe had been moving with a terrifying and reckless speed since the morning of the funeral. He explained that she was already liquidating David's personal portfolios, bypassing all standard corporate protocols. She was actively attempting to fire the entire executive board to replace them with loyalists from her own inner circle. Harrison said her ruthless corporate takeover tactics did not match the behavior of a grieving widow in any capacity. He knew something was deeply and fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. I reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive. I held it out to him. I told Harrison this piece of metal was the reason David died. I told him this was exactly what they killed my boy to protect. Harrison opened the trunk of his sedan. He pulled out a secure, encrypted laptop and rested it gently on the hood of the car. He booted up the machine and I plugged the flash drive into the side port. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing underground garage as the video file loaded onto the bright screen. I watched Harrison's face closely as the hidden camera footage played. I watched the color completely drain from his cheeks as Chloe appeared on the screen, kissing the rival chief executive officer and laughing in my son's kitchen. I saw the old lawyer's eyes widen in absolute horror as she crushed the synthetic stimulants and deliberately swapped them into David's daily prescription bottle. Harrison grabbed the edge of the car hood with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white. He watched the woman who had demanded my arrest casually plot the premeditated murder of the man he had mentored and considered a surrogate son. When the video finally ended, the silence in the parking garage was deafening. Harrison closed the laptop slowly. He stood perfectly still for a long time, staring blankly at the concrete wall ahead of him. Then he turned to face me. His eyes were no longer filled with sorrow or corporate professionalism. They were filled with a dangerous and fiercely calculating fury. Harrison told me that if we took this raw video to the local police department right now, Chloe's high-powered legal team would tie the evidence up in jurisdictional bureaucracy for months. They would immediately claim the footage was digitally altered or illegally obtained. They would bury the evidence in endless pretrial motions while Chloe finalized the corporate merger and vanished to a country with no extradition treaty. He said proving a complex medical murder in a standard court of law takes a massive amount of time, and time was the one resource we absolutely did not have. I asked him what we needed to do. I told him I was ready to follow his lead no matter the risk. Harrison explained that to destroy Chloe permanently, we had to hit her where she felt utterly invincible. We had to follow the money. We needed to prove the massive financial fraud that motivated the murder in the first place. He said if we could expose the illegal transfer of the $43 million, the federal authorities would step in immediately. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission do not play local corporate games. If we handed them irrefutable proof of wire fraud and corporate espionage directly linked to an assassination plot, Chloe and her lover would be locked in federal custody before her lawyers could even file a single motion to dismiss. But tracking that kind of sophisticated offshore money movement required skills neither of us possessed. Harrison looked around the empty garage and lowered his voice to a whisper. He told me he knew a guy. He did not mean a clean corporate accountant who worked in a shiny glass tower. He knew a brilliant underground forensic financial tracker. A ghost who operated completely off the grid, tracing hidden assets and offshore shell companies for people who needed absolute discretion and rapid results. Harrison reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. He handed it directly to me. I looked inside and saw stacks of crisp $100 bills. He told me to buy hot food, a clean set of clothes, and a quiet motel room on the extreme edge of town. He said he was going to make the call tonight and bring the underground tracker into the fold. I looked at the thick envelope of cash and then looked back at Harrison. I told him that helping a wanted fugitive and concealing evidence of a major crime would cost him his prestigious law license. I reminded him that it could potentially put him in a federal prison cell right alongside me if we failed this mission. Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. He zipped up his laptop bag and looked me square in the eye. He said he had spent his entire career playing by the rules of a broken legal system, that constantly protected monsters like Chloe. He told me David was a truly good man who deserved a long, beautiful life. Harrison declared with absolute certainty that he was willing to burn his entire prestigious career to the ground if it meant sending the woman who murdered his friend to a cold, concrete cell. We shook hands one more time. It was a silent, unbreakable pact between two men from entirely different worlds, united by the memory of a brilliant son who was taken far too soon. Harrison got into his sedan and drove slowly up the concrete ramp, his red taillights disappearing into the dark city night. I walked out of the underground garage with the heavy envelope of cash secured safely in my pocket. The freezing Chicago rain had finally stopped falling. The icy wind still bit harshly at my face, but the fire burning inside my chest was brighter and hotter than ever before. I was no longer a helpless victim, shivering under an overpass, waiting for the police to find me. I was part of a dangerous alliance. We were going to track every single penny Chloe was trying to steal. We were going to map out her entire intricate web of lies. And when she thought she was finally safe at the top of her stolen empire, we were going to pull the floor completely out from under her. I found a quiet 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city, ordered my first hot meal in days, and began to prepare my mind for the final war. The air inside the cramped basement safe house was thick with the smell of stale coffee and humming computer servers. For 2 days, I had been sitting on a rusted folding chair, watching a brilliant underground forensic accountant named Silas work absolute magic across a wall of glowing monitors. Harrison had found him for us. Silas was a ghost in the digital world, a man who specialized in tracing hidden money and exposing the financial crimes of the untouchable elite. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboards, entering commands and breaking through encrypted firewalls with a relentless, quiet intensity. I was running on nothing but pure adrenaline and the burning memory of my murdered son. Every time my exhausted eyes started to close, I saw David. I saw the absolute terror he must have felt in his final moments, and the heavy fatigue in my 65-year-old bones would instantly vanish, replaced by a cold, unyielding fury. It was late Thursday evening when the frantic tapping of Silas's keyboard suddenly stopped. The silence in the small room was immediate and suffocating. Harrison stood up from his corner, his old tweed suit wrinkled from sleeping in a desk chair. Silas turned around slowly, his eyes wide, reflecting the blue light of the computer screens. He did not smile. He rubbed his face with both hands and told us that we had a massive, catastrophic problem. Silas pointed to a series of offshore bank routing numbers that he had finally managed to decrypt. He explained the entire financial trap with a chilling mathematical clarity. Chloe and the rival executive Preston were not just stealing money. They were executing a total corporate erasure. Silas had tracked the stolen funds from David's accounts directly to a heavily shielded anonymous shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. But the money was currently sitting in a temporary holding trust. It could not be fully transferred, and the accounts could not be finalized until the corporate merger was officially signed by the board of directors. Silas pulled up an intercepted internal corporate memo from Preston's tech firm. The official board meeting was scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock the very next morning, Friday. It was going to take place in the master executive boardroom of Preston's corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. Silas explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of their timeline. The exact second Chloe signed that merger document, two things would happen instantly. First, David's groundbreaking life-saving medical software would legally become the exclusive private property of a ruthless billionaire who intended to strip it down and sell it to the highest bidder. David had spent his entire life building that software to help low-income community clinics afford advanced medical tech. Now it was going to be destroyed to maximize a corporate profit margin. Second, the ink on that signature would trigger an automated digital clearing protocol. It would flush the $43 million straight into the untouchable Cayman accounts, while simultaneously overwriting the original company ledgers. Silas looked at me with genuine deep sympathy. He said that once that digital ink dried, the trail of corporate embezzlement would be wiped completely clean. The fraud would vanish into thin air as if it never existed. Even if federal authorities raided the building 5 minutes later, they would find absolutely nothing but perfectly legal standard corporate restructuring documents. It would take a team of international lawyers a decade just to get a subpoena to look at the offshore accounts, and by then, Chloe and Preston would have vanished into extreme wealth and luxury. The clock was violently ticking. We had less than 24 hours to stop the ink from hitting that paper. If we did not breach that room by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, my son's murder would be permanently hidden behind an impenetrable wall of legitimate corporate paperwork. Harrison paced the length of the cramped basement, pulling frantically at his silver hair. He said we needed to take the flash drive containing the hidden nanny cam footage directly to the local authorities right now. But Silas shook his head, immediately shutting down that idea with cold logic. He explained that Chloe had already filed the emergency legal injunction against me. I was officially a hunted fugitive. The police and the media had branded me a violent, unstable extortionist who had brutally assaulted her brother. If Harrison walked into a police precinct with illegally obtained video footage supplied by a wanted man, the authorities would immediately impound the drive as evidence in my criminal assault case. They would spend weeks verifying the authenticity of the digital files. By the time any detective took the murder allegations seriously, Friday morning would be long gone. The money would be gone. The medical software would be gone. Chloe would be untouchable. There was only one way to stop the transfer. We had to hijack that board meeting and expose the murder plot in front of every single executive board member, corporate investor, and legal witness in the room. We had to create a public explosion so massive, so undeniable that the merger would be paralyzed instantly. But getting into that room was a logistical nightmare. Harrison unrolled a set of architectural blueprints he had pulled from the city public records database. He spread the large paper out over a folding table. Preston's corporate headquarters was a 60-story glass monolith situated right in the beating heart of the financial district. It was a fortress of modern security. Harrison pointed to the ground floor schematics explaining the overwhelming obstacles. The massive lobby was guarded by highly trained private armed security contractors. The guest lists were strictly scrutinized by legal teams before anyone was allowed to approach the front desk. But the absolute worst part was the technology. Harrison pointed to a series of red dots on the blueprint. The main entrance, the parking garage, and the elevator banks featured state-of-the-art facial recognition cameras tied directly to local law enforcement databases. Because Chloe went on television and branded me an armed, unstable fugitive, my face was actively flagged in their security system. Harrison looked at me with a profound, crushing sense of defeat. He told me that my face was broadcasting on every local news channel every 30 minutes. If I walked within 2 blocks of that glass tower, the street cameras would catch me. If I somehow miraculously made it through the revolving glass doors, the facial recognition software would lock the security turnstiles instantly. The armed guards would tackle me to the polished marble floor, and I would be locked in the back of a police cruiser before I ever made it to the elevator banks. We were completely locked out of the building. I stared down at the blueprints spread across the table. My jaw was locked tight. The wealthy elite loved to build their shiny glass towers reaching high into the sky. They loved to look down on the rest of the world from their insulated penthouse suites. They believe their money, their private guards, and their advanced technology make them completely invincible. They look at a man like me, a 65-year-old black man with calloused hands and worn-out work boots, and they see absolutely nothing to fear. They think we are invisible. They think we are powerless. But they always forget who built the foundations they stand on. I leaned over the table, tracing my scarred finger along the faded blue lines of the architectural schematics. I ignored the lobby. I ignored the high-speed elevators. I ignored the shiny glass exterior. My eyes dropped to the very bottom of the blueprints, down to the deep subterranean levels that most corporate executives never even knew existed. I asked Silas to pull up the older municipal city grid maps on his monitors. Silas quickly typed on his keyboard, bringing up the historical public transit layouts from 30 years ago. I looked at the glowing screen, and a slow, steady rhythm returned to my heartbeat. I had spent 40 years of my life working the rail yards and dispatching heavy freight through the massive, dark, subterranean grids of Chicago and other major cities. I knew the damp, concrete belly of a metropolis better than any modern architect. I looked at the screen and pointed to a thick gray line running directly beneath the deep foundations of Preston's corporate tower. I told Harrison that they built their shiny new fortress directly over the old municipal transit subway grid. Specifically, they built it over Sector 7, which housed the massive pressurized maintenance shafts for the underground utility lines. Those shafts were poured thick with heavy concrete decades ago to ventilate the deep train tunnels. When the corporate tower was constructed, they tied their sub-basement utility levels directly into those old municipal shafts to vent their industrial heating systems. Harrison stared at me, his eyes narrowing, as he tried to grasp what I was suggesting. I explained the gritty mechanics of the old city. I told him that those massive maintenance shafts contained industrial service elevators and heavy iron utility ladders that completely bypassed the entire modern security system. There were no facial recognition cameras in the damp concrete belly of the city. There were no private armed security guards patrolling the dark, pressurized tunnels where the old steam pipes leaked. The wealthy tech executives upstairs did not care about the dirt and the rust beneath their expensive shoes. I mapped out the exact route with my finger on the screen. I told them I would not go anywhere near the street-level lobby. I would enter the abandoned rail tunnels 2 miles outside the financial district, where the old tracks plunged underground, away from the public eye. I would walk through the pitch-black darkness beneath the city streets, navigating the forgotten labyrinth of transit shafts, until I reached the exact coordinates directly beneath the corporate tower. From there, I would access the pressurized maintenance shaft. I would have to physically climb the heavy iron utility ladder, moving vertically through the hidden walls of the building. I would climb straight past the lobby, completely bypass the security turnstiles, and avoid every single facial recognition camera until I reached the executive floor access hatch. We were going to hijack the boardroom from the inside out. Silas and Harrison stared at me in absolute stunned disbelief. Silas pointed out that the maintenance shaft climbed 40 stories straight up into the air. He asked if a man my age could physically survive a vertical climb like that, in a confined, pressurized concrete tube. He warned me with genuine fear in his voice that the heat radiating from the industrial steam pipes would be suffocating easily, reaching over 100 degrees. He told me that the iron rungs of the ladder would be slick with decades of condensation and rust. One single slip of my boots, one moment of muscle failure would mean falling hundreds of feet into the concrete darkness below to a certain death. I looked at the young accountant. I thought about the deep pain radiating through my knees just from standing in this damp basement. I thought about the severe arthritis in my hands and the heavy lingering ache in my chest from breathing the freezing city air while sleeping under the overpass. He was entirely right to be concerned. I was not a young man anymore. The brutal physical toll of my life was carved deep into every line on my face and every scar on my knuckles. But then I thought about the video on that small silver flash drive. I thought about Chloe casually crushing those synthetic stimulants, laughing with her lover as she prepared to murder my only child. I thought about David swallowing his medication, trusting the woman he loved with his whole heart, only to feel his pulse race out of control while he died completely alone, desperately trying to leave a clue for his father. The burning, righteous fury that consumed my soul was far stronger than any physical pain my aging body could ever produce. I looked Silas dead in the eye and told him that physical pain meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I told him I had spent my entire life hauling heavy steel, throwing frozen track switches, and surviving the most brutal winters the world could throw at me to provide for my family. I told him I would crawl up that maintenance shaft using only my bare hands and my teeth if I had to. Nothing in this world, not armed guards, not facial recognition cameras, and not a 40-story vertical climb was going to stop me from reaching that room. Harrison placed his hand firmly on my shoulder. He did not doubt me for a single second. He had seen the exact same relentless determination in David when my son built his company from a tiny, struggling startup into a global powerhouse. Harrison knew the stubborn, unbreakable blood that ran in my veins. He turned to Silas and told him to begin syncing the flash drive to a remote broadcasting server immediately. We spent the next 10 hours preparing the final counterattack. Silas worked frantically, his fingers flying across the keys as he wrote a custom, highly aggressive broadcast override script. He explained that if I could breach the boardroom from the utility access hatch and physically plug the USB drive into their main presentation console, he could execute a remote digital override from this basement. He would lock the entire corporate system, forcing the hidden nanny cam footage to broadcast simultaneously on every single smart monitor and presentation screen in the executive suite. He promised me that nobody in that room would be able to pause, mute, or shut down the video until the entire horrific truth was fully exposed. Harrison outlined his crucial role in the strike. While I infiltrated the building from the underground shadows, Harrison would gather a select group of high-ranking federal investigators he implicitly trusted from his decades of legal practice. He would wait in an unmarked vehicle right outside the glass tower, perfectly timing his entrance. The exact moment I breached the boardroom and triggered the video, Harrison would march straight through the front doors with the federal authorities. He would use the sudden massive chaos and the undeniable live broadcast of the video evidence as immediate probable cause to bypass the building security, freeze the boardroom, and place Chloe and Preston under federal arrest. The plan was incredibly dangerous. It required absolute flawless precision. If I was caught navigating the tunnels, I would be arrested for criminal trespassing and locked away as a violent fugitive forever. If my strength failed me on the ladder and I fell, my son's murderers would win. If I failed to reach the boardroom before the clock struck 10, the merger would be completely finalized. The offshore transfer would instantly execute, and my son's murder would be legally erased from history. We were betting absolutely everything on an exhausted old man navigating a forgotten, decaying concrete grid. As the sun began to rise on Friday morning, painting the stormy city sky in heavy shades of gray when I stood up from the folding table. I rolled my shoulders, feeling the familiar deep stiffness, but ignoring it entirely. I put on my dark canvas work jacket and zipped the small silver flash drive securely into the pocket, resting right over my heart. I grabbed a heavy industrial flashlight and a solid steel crowbar from a dusty toolbox in the corner of the basement. Harrison walked me to the back steel door of the dry cleaner. He looked deeply exhausted, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He told me to be careful in the dark. He said David would be incredibly proud of the man fighting for his legacy today. I shook his hand, gripping it tight, and told him I would see him on the 40th floor. I stepped out into the cold, misty morning air. The massive city was waking up completely unaware of the brutal war that was about to unfold in the sky above. I walked steadily toward the distant industrial sector, where the old transit tunnels began. I was a 65-year-old fugitive carrying the absolute undeniable truth in my pocket. I was walking into the deep forgotten shadows beneath the city, ready to climb out of the darkness and tear the arrogant monsters straight from their thrones. The clock was ticking down to 10, and I was bringing the reckoning right to their door. The heat inside the vertical maintenance shaft was a living, breathing monster. Every time I pulled my weight up the rusted iron rungs, my shoulders screamed in absolute agony. I was a 65-year-old man, pushing a body that had already been worn down by 40 years of hauling steel in the freezing Chicago rail yards. The thick, heavy air tasted like ancient dust and evaporating steam. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and soaking my collar, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Inside the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket, wrapped securely against my chest, was the small silver flash drive. That tiny piece of metal was the only thing standing between my murdered son and the people who conspired to erase his entire existence. I pulled myself up another rung, my muscles trembling violently. I checked my worn wristwatch in the dim light of my industrial flashlight. It was 9:45 in the morning. I was running out of time. I pushed through the suffocating darkness until my head finally bumped against a heavy metal grating. I had reached the top of the pressurized utility shaft, right behind the walls of the executive penthouse suite. I clicked off my flashlight. Through the narrow slats of the louvered vent, a bright, sterile light spilled into my dark concrete tube. The cold, conditioned air of the corporate fortress drifted through the metal, cooling the sweat on my forehead. I shifted my weight carefully, bracing my boots against the iron ladder, and peered through the slats. The sheer opulence of the room on the other side of the wall was staggering. It was a massive corner boardroom, encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the sprawling skyline of downtown Atlanta. The floors were covered in pristine, thick white carpets that looked like fresh snow. At the center of the room, sat thus a magnificent custom glass and chrome conference table. This was the fortress where they thought they were invincible. This was the room where they planned to carve up David's $43 million empire and sell it to the highest bidder. Standing at the head of the table was Chloe. She did not look like a woman who had just buried her husband a few days ago. She looked radiant, triumphant, and absolutely predatory. She was wearing a sharp, tailored white designer suit that probably cost more than I used to make in an entire year at the rail yard. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and a massive diamond necklace glittered under the recessed lighting. Standing right beside her was Preston, the slick, arrogant chief executive officer of the rival tech firm. He was wearing a custom charcoal gray suit, his hand resting casually on the small of Chloe's back. They were completely relaxed. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the father of the man they murdered was clinging to a rusted ladder just 3 feet behind their expensive mahogany-paneled wall. It was exactly 9:50. The massive mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open, and a team of corporate lawyers poured into the room. They carried thick leather briefcases and stacks of bound legal documents. Preston smiled a broad shark-like grin and clapped his hands together. A junior assistant scurried over to a wet bar in the corner and pulled a chilled bottle of imported champagne from a silver bucket. I watched through the narrow vent as the cork popped. The soft, celebratory sound echoed off the glass walls. The assistant poured the bubbling golden liquid into tall crystal flutes and handed them to Chloe and Preston. My grip on the iron ladder tightened until my knuckles ached. I watched the woman who had crushed lethal synthetic stimulants into my son's morning coffee raise her glass in a joyful toast. She looked around the room, her eyes shining with fake gratitude, and thanked the board members for their support during her tragic time of grief. She spun a beautiful, sickening lie, right there in front of the city skyline, talking about how David would have wanted this merger. She claimed she was honoring his vision by uniting their companies. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically choke on it. My son built his medical software to save lives in poor neighborhoods, not to line the pockets of greedy corporate vultures. He died terrified and alone, trying to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for his old man. And here she was, drinking champagne over his grave. The lead attorney placed a massive stack of heavily bound contracts right in the center of the glass table. He opened to the final page, which was marked with a cluster of bright red signature tabs. The clock on the boardroom wall ticked relentlessly. It was 9:55. In exactly 5 minutes, the digital clearing protocol would activate. The second Chloe signed her name on that dotted line, David's entire software patent would be transferred permanently to Preston. The $43 million would instantly vanish into an untraceable web of offshore Cayman Island accounts, and the original company ledgers would be wiped completely clean. The undeniable proof of their corporate embezzlement would be erased from the face of the earth forever. Preston reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, gleaming gold fountain pen. He handed it to Chloe with a look of absolute, intimate victory. Their eyes locked, sharing a silent, secret acknowledgement of the murder they had committed together. Chloe smiled, took the gold pen, and leaned over the glass table. She positioned the tip of the pen just millimeters above the thick paper. She was ready to strike the final blow. She was ready to win. I did not wait for the clock to strike 10. I braced my heavy steel toe boots against the iron rungs of the ladder. I planted my hands flat against the thick metal grating that separated the damp utility shaft from the pristine boardroom. I thought about the long, agonizing nights I spent sleeping in the freezing mud under the expressway. I thought about the media painting me as a violent, unhinged fugitive. I thought about David falling asleep on my chest when he was just a little boy dreaming of changing the world. I gathered every single ounce of raw, unadulterated fury coursing through my blood and shoved the heavy grate with all my might. The rusted hinges of the maintenance access hatch screamed in protest before snapping completely under the pressure. The heavy metal grate blew outward, crashing violently onto the immaculate white carpet, with a deafening metallic clang that shook the entire room. The hidden service doors kicked wide open violently, disrupting the quiet corporate sanctuary. The champagne flute slipped from Chloe's hand and shattered against the glass table, sending shards and golden liquid exploding everywhere. The lawyers jumped out of their seats, dropping their briefcases in absolute terror. Preston stumbled backward, bumping into the wall. I stepped out of the dark, pressurized tunnel and walked straight into the bright, glaring light of the boardroom. I was a terrifying sight. My heavy canvas coat was soaked in sweat and covered in thick black industrial tunnel grease. My face was smeared with dark soot and rust. My gray hair was wild, and my breathing was heavy, but my eyes were locked dead onto the woman who murdered my child. With every step I took, my heavy steel toe boots left massive, thick black footprints of toxic sludge stamped deeply into their $1,000,000 white rugs. I was the gritty, dirty truth invading their sterile palace of lies. I was the consequence they thought they had buried. Chloe stood frozen, staring at me as if a corpse had just crawled out of a grave and walked into her office. Her face completely drained of color, turning a sickly ash gray. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire widow was suddenly gone, replaced by a cornered, feral animal staring at the one man she could not destroy. She looked at my soot-covered face and the unyielding rage burning in my eyes, and she knew instantly that her entire fortress had collapsed. She finally found her voice. She unleashed a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the glass windows. She stumbled backward, pointing a manic, trembling finger directly at my chest. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that someone stop me. She yelled that I was the violent fugitive from the news broadcasts. She screamed for the 2 private armed security guards stationed near the main mahogany doors to draw their weapons and shoot me dead right where I stood. The 2 massive guards reacted instantly to her frantic commands. They stepped forward, blocking the only normal exit, their hands dropping swiftly to the heavy black holsters strapped to their hips. The lead guard shouted at me to freeze and put my hands in the air. The corporate lawyers dove under the glass table, terrified that bullets were about to start flying. Preston shouted for someone to call the police immediately, demanding that I be arrested for trespassing and attempted assault. They thought they still had the upper hand. They thought I was just a desperate, cornered old man who had foolishly trapped himself in a room full of heavily armed enemies. I did not freeze. I did not raise my hands. I did not show a single trace of fear. I stood tall in the center of the ruined white carpet, ignoring the guards completely. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my grease-stained jacket. Chloe shrieked again, screaming that I had a weapon. The guards unsnapped their holsters, preparing to draw. But I did not pull out a gun. I pulled out the small silver flash drive and held it up right in the light where everyone in the room could see it clearly. I looked directly at Chloe and watched the absolute primal terror wash over her features as she recognized exactly what I was holding. Before the security guards could draw their weapons, before Preston could lunge at me to grab the drive, a cheerful electronic chime echoed loudly through the chaotic room. It was the sound of the main private executive elevator arriving at the penthouse floor. The heavy polished steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a smooth, quiet glide. The 2 armed security guards spun around, expecting to see more corporate executives arriving for the merger. Instead, the air in the room seemed to freeze completely. Stepping out of the elevator, completely ignoring the chaos and the shattered glass, was Harrison. The old lawyer was wearing his same wrinkled tweed suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase and projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. But Harrison was not alone. Flanking him on all sides, stepping out of the elevator, in perfect synchronized formation, were 4 massive federal agents. They were not local city police who could be bought or manipulated by Chloe's high-priced lawyers. They were wearing dark navy windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters printed boldly across their chests and backs. Right behind them were 2 sharp-looking investigators in dark suits wearing official badges from the Securities and Exchange Commission, strapped to their belts. The dynamic in the room flipped completely upside down in a fraction of a second. The private armed security guards immediately took their hands off their holsters and stepped back, shrinking against the wall, as the heavily armed federal agents marched into the boardroom. The corporate lawyers peeking out from under the glass table realized instantly that this was no longer a business meeting. This was a major federal raid. Harrison walked past the terrified guards, past the trembling lawyers, and stopped right beside me in the center of the room. He looked at the black footprints of soot and grease trailing from the broken maintenance hatch, and gave me a grim, silent nod of profound respect. We had made it. The clock on the wall read 9:58. The $43 million transfer had not been signed. The money was still frozen in the holding accounts, and the illegal merger had been stopped dead in its tracks. Harrison turned his cold, fierce gaze toward the head of the table. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at Chloe and Preston. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice cut through the silent room with the sharp, heavy weight of absolute justice. He announced to the federal agents and everyone present that the woman standing at the head of the table was no longer the executor of the estate. He declared that we possessed undeniable, legally obtained video evidence proving massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the premeditated murder of my son. Chloe backed into the glass window, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for any possible escape. Preston raised his hands, trying to back away from her, trying to distance himself from the sinking ship. The federal agents spread out across the room, securing the doors and moving aggressively toward the head of the glass table. I stood in my filthy work boots holding the silver drive that contained my son's final truth, looking at the monsters who took his life. The reign of the untouchable elite was over, and the reckoning had finally arrived. The room was perfectly still. Harrison moved with a calm and deliberate purpose that commanded the complete attention of every single person standing in that penthouse boardroom. He walked over to the state-of-the-art presentation console, built right into the center of the massive glass and mahogany table. The federal agents held their positions by the heavy wooden doors, ensuring nobody could slip out. The corporate executives and board members who had gathered to carve up my son's legacy were frozen in their expensive leather chairs. Harrison took the small silver flash drive from my grease-stained hands. I felt a tremendous physical weight lift from my tired shoulders the exact moment my fingers let go of that metal casing. Harrison plugged the drive directly into the main system hub. A low electronic hum vibrated through the room as a massive motorized projection screen descended slowly from the ceiling. The heavy window blinds automatically lowered, plunging the entire corporate sanctuary into a dramatic cinematic darkness. Then the screen flared to life. The high-definition footage my boy had risked everything to record illuminated the faces of the terrified billionaires sitting around the table. The hidden nanny cam video was crystal clear. It showed David's beautiful living room, the home we had painted together years ago with our own hands. And right there in the center of the frame was Chloe holding a crystal glass of champagne and laughing playfully with Preston. The audio was absolutely flawless. The sound of their cruel, mocking voices echoed off the thick glass walls of the boardroom. Every person in that room heard Preston clearly detail the lethal chemical properties of the synthetic stimulants he had brought. Every person watched in absolute horrified silence as Chloe dumped my son's real heart medication down the kitchen sink. They watched her crush the deadly pills with a heavy stainless steel muddler. They heard her say how she could not wait to be a wealthy widow and inherit everything David had built. The reaction in the boardroom was instantaneous and explosive. The lead corporate attorney for the board of directors, a man who just minutes ago was ready to hand over a $43 million empire, covered his mouth with his hands in sheer physical disgust. The investors gasped out loud, looking away from the screen in horror. You could practically hear the illusion of Chloe's grieving widow routine shattering into a million jagged pieces right there on the pristine white carpet. The undeniable truth was staring them right in the face. This was not a tragic cardiovascular failure caused by the heavy stress of the tech industry. This was a cold-blooded, calculated, and meticulously planned execution. Preston was the first to completely lose his composure. The slick, arrogant chief executive officer who thought he could buy the world suddenly realized his entire life of luxury was completely over. The color drained out of his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child trapped in a nightmare. He stumbled backward away from the projection screen and wildly held up his hands. He started shouting over the audio of the video, trying to spin a pathetic, desperate lie. He pointed his shaking finger directly at Chloe and yelled that she was insane. He screamed to the federal investigators that he had absolutely nothing to do with the actual murder. He claimed she acted entirely alone and that she had tricked him into signing the corporate merger. He was throwing the woman he had just kissed under the proverbial bus without a single second of hesitation to save his own skin. But the federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were not interested in his frantic, pathetic excuses. Before Preston could take another step toward the emergency exit, two massive agents wearing heavy Navy windbreakers moved with terrifying speed. They grabbed the billionaire by the shoulders of his custom-tailored suit and violently slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany conference table. The heavy thud of his body hitting the hard wood vibrated through the soles of my boots. One of the agents twisted Preston's arms sharply behind his back, pulling out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The cold, metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room as they locked his wrists together. A senior investigator stepped forward and loudly advised Preston that he was under federal arrest for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and massive wire fraud. The rich tech titan was dragged away from the table, whining and sobbing like a common street criminal. It was a beautiful, deeply satisfying sight to witness. Then the attention of the entire room turned to the true architect of my son's demise. Chloe stood completely isolated at the head of the glass table. Her own highly paid legal team had physically backed away from her, retreating to the far corners of the room, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. The brilliant, confident facade she had worn to the country club funeral was completely destroyed. Her perfect blonde hair was unraveling and out of place. Her breath came in short, ragged, panic-stricken gasps. She looked around the boardroom, searching frantically for a single friendly face, a single ally, but she found absolutely nothing but intense disgust and federal badges. The reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her shoulders. The $43 million were gone. The luxury mansion was gone. Her freedom was gone forever. Chloe's knees buckled underneath her. She collapsed onto the pristine white carpet, ruining her expensive designer skirt in the process. She began to weep, but these were not the carefully practiced, flawless tears she had shed for the news cameras to gain public sympathy. These were the ugly, desperate tears of a predator who realized she was about to be locked in a concrete cage for the rest of her natural life. She dropped to her hands and knees and actually began to crawl across the floor toward me. She looked up at my soot-covered face, sobbing hysterically. She cried out, "Dad, please." She begged me using my first name. "Tyrone, please listen to me." She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, pleading for any kind of mercy I could offer. She screamed for me to think of David, to think of the beautiful love they once shared. She had the absolute terrifying audacity to beg me to think of our family. She cried that it was a terrible mistake, that she was manipulated by Preston, and that she desperately needed my forgiveness. She asked me to tell the federal agents to stop, to just give her one more chance to explain everything. I stood perfectly still. My heavy work boots were planted firmly on the ruined white rug. I looked down at the wealthy woman, weeping pathetically at my feet. For months, I had carried a suffocating, unbearable ocean of grief and guilt inside my soul. I had blamed myself for being an absent father who worked too much. I had slept on frozen concrete under city overpasses, eating discarded scraps of food from trash cans, while she slept in silk sheets bought with my son's blood. Now, looking at her groveling in the dirt of her own making, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, stone, heavy peace. The ghost of my boy was standing right beside me, and his soul was finally free to rest. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to be heard. I spoke with a quiet, resonant authority that carried to every single corner of that penthouse boardroom. I told her she was not my family. I told her my family was a brilliant, kind young man who just wanted to use his incredible mind to heal the world. My words echoed in the silent room as I looked deep into her terrified eyes. I told her she was nothing but the disease that took my boy away from me. And I promised her right then and there that today was her cure. The senior agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped around the glass table and grabbed Chloe by the arm, hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name as they twisted her arms behind her back. The agent loudly read her the Miranda rights outlining the federal charges of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around her wrists with a beautiful, undeniable finality. I watched with a fierce, deeply righteous satisfaction as they dragged her struggling body toward the private elevator. She screamed the entire way, stripped of her fake grief, her unearned wealth, and every single thing she had ever valued in this world. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off her cries completely. The monster was finally gone. Harrison walked up to me and placed a warm, steady hand on my tired shoulder. He looked at the empty boardroom, and then out the massive glass windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The dark storm clouds that had been punishing the city all morning were finally beginning to break apart, allowing bright rays of golden sunlight to spill across the tall buildings. We had done it. We had honored David's final wish. We had secured his company, ensuring that his life-saving software would be used to help the people who truly needed it, just as he had always intended. I let out a long, trembling sigh, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lift from my aging bones. I was ready to go back home to Chicago. Life will test you in ways you never thought possible. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones holding the knife behind their backs, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But you have to trust your instincts as a parent. If something feels wrong, if the pieces do not fit together, you must demand the truth, no matter how deeply it hurts to uncover it. Greed and malice will always build elaborate, shiny fortresses to hide their terrible sins, but no lie can stand forever against a person armed with righteous determination and the absolute truth. You must fight for the ones you love even when they are gone, because justice is rarely given freely. It must be demanded with everything you have left. If my story touched your heart today, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old father's soul. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next life stories I will share with you. Please tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me incredibly happy to know which corner of the country or the world is keeping me company today. Take care of your loved ones and always stand up for what is right. See you in the next story. 6 months can feel like a fleeting, insignificant shadow, or an entire agonizing lifetime depending entirely on which side of the reinforced prison glass you happen to be sitting on. For me, the last half year has been a slow, steady, and purposeful march back into the warm light of day. The chaotic media circus that surrounded the corporate scandal finally packed up their flashing cameras and moved on to the next tragedy. The aggressive corporate lawyers retreated to their sterile glass towers. And Chloe, the woman who truly believed she could murder my only child and buy the entire world with his stolen blood, is currently rotting away in a high-security federal penitentiary awaiting a trial she is absolutely guaranteed to lose. She was forced to permanently trade her custom-tailored silk designer suits for a scratchy standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Her hidden offshore bank accounts her secret Cayman Island trusts, and her luxury real estate holdings were completely seized by the federal government. She will spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a tiny concrete box, stripped of every single superficial luxury she valued more than human life. And every night when I close my eyes, I pray that she lives a very long, healthy life, so she can sit in the dark and think about exactly what she threw away. As for the estate, the probate courts moved with surprising, unprecedented speed once the federal authorities officially handed over the mountain of digital evidence. The presiding judge swiftly and legally stripped Chloe of all marital rights and officially named me the sole legal executor of David's $43 million software empire. It is a sum of money so incredibly massive that my tired brain still has a hard time comprehending the sheer scale of it. Some folks in my old neighborhood genuinely thought I was going to completely lose my mind. They expected the retired soot-covered railroad dispatcher to immediately go out and buy a sprawling gated mansion in Buckhead, hire a fancy private chef, and fill a massive temperature-controlled garage with imported European sports cars. That is exactly what most people do when they suddenly hit the financial lottery. But this was not lottery money. This was not a lucky scratch-off ticket. This was my son's sweat, his unparalleled brilliance, his countless sleepless nights, and ultimately, his life. It was profoundly sacred blood money, and I was not about to disrespect his sacrifice by living like a spoiled king. I did not buy a sprawling mansion. I did not buy a single shiny luxury car. Instead, I packed my few humble belongings, gassed up my battered old pickup truck, drove back up north, and quietly returned to my humble, peaceful home in the south side of Chicago. I sat in the exact same worn-out leather armchair where David used to sit for hours doing his high school math homework. I drank black coffee from the exact same chipped ceramic mug I had used for 20 years. I slept soundly in my own simple bed. The tens of millions of dollars sitting in the bank accounts did not change the core of the man I am. A man who has worked with heavy steel, freezing rain, and axle grease for 40 years knows deep in his bones that true wealth is never something you can park in a paved driveway or wear on your wrist. True wealth is the enduring legacy you leave behind for the people who come after you. I sat down in a modest office with Harrison and a specialized team of highly trusted financial advisors. I told them quite clearly that I did not want to manage a cutthroat tech company, nor did I want to hoard this massive fortune in some untouchable, invisible investment portfolio. I wanted to completely fulfill the beautiful dream my boy had when he first started writing computer code at my scratched kitchen table. We systematically liquidated the corporate assets, sold off the luxury properties, and funneled every single dime into a brand new, highly protected charitable entity. We proudly established the David Medical Tech Foundation. We bypassed the greedy corporate hospitals and the elite high society medical boards entirely. Instead, we built state-of-the-art, fully staffed medical clinics right here in the underprivileged, forgotten neighborhoods of Chicago. We set up comprehensive programs providing completely free healthcare, advanced medical screening, and vital ongoing mental health support for the hardworking low-income youth in our city. We bought back the exact same cutting-edge diagnostic software David had originally designed and gave it away completely free of charge to struggling community centers that desperately needed the technology. Now every single time a worried young mother gets a free medical scan for her sick child, David is there. Every time a troubled, isolated teenager finds a safe, quiet place to talk to a professional counselor without ever having to worry about an expensive medical bill, David's legacy lives on. The foundation is currently funding full 4-year college scholarships for 50 brilliant young black kids who want to study software engineering, just like my boy did. They are kids who ride the same buses David rode, walking the same cracked sidewalks, dreaming the exact same big dreams. Chloe tried to completely erase him from the world, but instead I made absolutely sure his name is going to save thousands upon thousands of lives for generations to come. It was a warm, incredibly bright Tuesday afternoon when I finally felt emotionally ready to visit him. The brutal, punishing Chicago winter had finally broken, surrendering to a gentle, forgiving, and beautiful spring. The sun was shining brightly in the clear blue sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet, rolling green hills of the cemetery. I walked slowly down the paved, winding path, listening to the joyful sound of the birds singing high up in the old oak trees. I did not wear my stiff, uncomfortable Sunday suit this time. I wore my favorite faded denim jacket, a comfortable cotton shirt, and my scuffed old work boots. I was not a corporate executor or a man of wealth today. I was just a loving father going to see his precious son. I stopped walking when I reached the polished granite headstone. It was simple, dignified, and engraved with a single profound line that read, "A brilliant mind, a loving son, a light that will never fade." I stood there, in the quiet stillness, for a very long time, letting the warm, fragrant spring breeze wash over my weathered face. The heavy, suffocating ocean of dark grief that had anchored me to the floor for so many agonizing months was finally gone. The burning, toxic, blinding rage that had fueled my relentless war against his murderers had completely burned out, leaving behind a profound, unbreakable, and lasting peace. I reached deep into my denim jacket pocket and pulled out a single, perfectly vibrant yellow rose. It was his beautiful mother's absolute favorite flower. I knelt down slowly, my old knees popping softly in the quiet air, and laid the bright yellow petals gently against the cold, gray stone. I reached out with my calloused hand and tenderly brushed a stray blade of green grass off the engraved lettering of his name. I spoke to him out loud, my voice steady, clear, and full of immense pride in the quiet cemetery. I told him that his old man finally did it. I told him the ruthless monsters who hurt him were locked away in the dark, and they would never see the sun again. I told him his corporate company was gone, but his beautiful dream was alive, thriving, and breathing in the very streets where he grew up. I told him the clinic doors were wide open, the neighborhood kids were learning, and his lifetime of hard work was absolutely not for nothing. "I protected your legacy, son," I whispered gently, the words catching slightly in my throat, but filled with immense love. "I kept my promise to you. You can rest now, my beautiful boy. Your old man took care of absolutely everything." I stood back up, straightening my back, and took a deep, full breath of the fresh spring air. For the first time since that terrible, world-shattering morning, the hospital called me, my chest did not hurt. The heavy, invisible weight that had been crushing my lungs was completely gone. I knew deep in my spirit that David was standing right there beside me, smiling that quiet, gentle, familiar smile, finally at peace. And for the first time in a very long time, as I walked slowly back down the path toward my truck, I was at peace too. Life is a fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying journey. Sometimes the people we trust the most, the ones we let into our homes and our hearts, are the exact ones who harbor the darkest, most dangerous secrets. Sometimes the world tries to break you down, steal your joy, and convince you that a simple, hardworking person cannot possibly fight against immense power and massive wealth. But let me tell you something important that I learned in the darkest, coldest trenches of my life. The truth is a relentless, unstoppable force. Love, genuine, unconditional love between a parent and a child, is stronger than any amount of stolen money, stronger than any corporate conspiracy, and stronger than death itself. If you ever find yourself standing alone in the dark, stripped of everything you hold dear, do not ever give up. Dig your boots into the ground, remember exactly who you are, and fight relentlessly for the light. Justice may be blind, but it is never deaf to a father who completely refuses to be silenced. If this story resonated with your spirit today, please do me a favor and hit that like button to bring a little comfort and sunshine to this old father's heart. Make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life stories I will share with you. And please take a moment to tell me in the comments exactly which city or country you are watching this video from, and what time of day it is over there right now. It fills my heart with so much joy and gratitude to know which corner of the world is keeping me company and listening to my voice. Share your thoughts, share your own experiences, and let us build a beautiful community of strength together. Give your children an extra hug today, tell them how much you love them, and never take a single second for granted. A big, warm hug to all of you. See you in the next story, with absolute love and respect. To all the fathers, mothers, and grandparents out there listening to my voice right now, I need you to hear me clearly and take these words to heart. We spend our entire lives breaking our backs to build a safe harbor for our children. We sacrifice our own dreams and pour every ounce of our sweat and soul into giving them the world we never had. But you must never let your unconditional love for your babies blind you to the venomous snakes that might silently slither into their littoes. The world is a beautiful place, but it is also filled with ruthless predators disguised in designer suits and charming, innocent smiles. Money changes people in ways that are absolutely terrifying. It strips away their humanity and reveals the cold, ruthless calculation hiding underneath. I learned the hardest way possible that the most dangerous enemies do not always wait for you in dark city alleys. Sometimes they sit comfortably at your dinner table, smile right in your face, and sleep directly under the same roof as the people you cherish most in this world. When you find yourself standing face to face with that kind of pure evil, it is incredibly easy to feel completely overwhelmed. You might feel like a tired old man or woman fighting a battle you cannot possibly win against people with endless resources and powerful connections. But remember this one crucial piece of wisdom that kept me breathing when I was sleeping on frozen concrete with nothing but the clothes on my back. The truth is exactly like a mighty, fierce lion. You do not ever have to defend it. You do not have to dress it up or protect it from the wolves. You just have to unlock the cage and let it loose. Once that cage is open, the truth will step out and absolutely defend itself. It will tear down the most expensive corporate fortresses and rip straight through the thickest webs of lies. If this old man's journey touched your spirit today, if you felt the deep pain and the ultimate righteous victory of a father fighting to protect his murdered son, please do me a simple favor. Go ahead and hit that like button to bring a little sunshine and warmth into this tired father's soul. It reminds me that there are still good, honest folks out there who truly understand the immense value of family loyalty and justice. Make sure you hit subscribe to this channel and join our growing community so you absolutely do not miss the real-life stories I will be sharing with you next. We have a lot more truth to uncover together down this road. And before you log off today, please drop down into the comments section and talk to me. Tell me exactly what city, state, or country you are watching this video from, and let me know what time it is right there on your clock. It brings an immense amount of joy to my heart to see how far these words travel, and to know exactly which beautiful corner of the world is keeping me company today. Your support means absolutely everything to a man who once thought he had lost his entire universe. Keep your eyes wide open, keep your families incredibly close, and never stop fighting for what is right. God bless every single one of you, and I will see you in the very next story.